This is The Vampire Tales, Dusk Shadows, Fae Wilds Series, Book 7 by WJMay. Copyright 2023 by WJMay, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. What's a girl to do when a vampire claims to be her mate? For Hollie, a human bystander drawn into a world of supernatural beings, not running was never an option. The problem is, he keeps finding her. With the help of her Fae friends and a witch with a clutter issue, Hollie has a plan to knock the vamp out of her life permanently. It's easier said than done when an imp in disguise starts to interfere. She's not sure what's worse, running away from the vamp or being caught by him. Prologue. The stone corridor rang with screams, but Maz no longer heard them. So inured was he to the sound. Millennia of ragged shrieks and desperate pleading washed over him like surf on the rocks of a jagged shoreline under a night of endless darkness. And like those rocks, he was unmoved, unchanged in his stoic resoluteness. It wasn't that he didn't care. It was that he hadn't cared for so long that he no longer noticed the pain soaked into every inch of the halls of punishment. The atmosphere of the place, like the rest of the realm, was lost on him. An off-worlder who found himself in the realm ruled by the angel of death might tremble at the sulphur-tinged gloom, the moans of agony that seemed to echo from every square inch of the place, but to Maz, it was as normal as a cup of tea. Simply put, Pluto was home. Letting himself through a heavy wooden door, he nodded to the guard stationed on the other side. The guard nodded back, the strips of decaying skin hanging from his cheeks shifting against the exposed bone of his skull. Maz could smell the sickly sweet stench of roasted flesh, an odor that used to make him queasy when he was young, just after Samael had turned him. It was so long ago he could barely remember it. Maz would never forget the circumstance that had brought him to Pluto, one of the 17 hells of the multiverse. Samael had taken pains to make him remember, the memory and example of the absolute power the angel of death held over him. Samael was one of the princes of darkness, members of the court of chaos, servants of Shaitan himself. The princes known as archons among those with the longest memories were beings of enormous strength, their abilities second to only Shaitan, whom many considered the most powerful single being in the web. Each archon ruled over a realm of their own, though none so vile and feared as Pluto, and of all the princes of darkness, Samael was the one most cloaked in mystery. Not like the multiverse is missing out, Maz thought to himself as he made his way into the bowels of the stone keep, where prisoners were kept for punishment. If they knew the angel of death like I do, they might wonder what all the fuss is about. It wasn't that his boss wasn't capable of dark deeds. He was, and on an epic scale. Civilizations had fallen at the arch of his eyebrow. It was the prince's penchant for scheming that made him less than entertaining. Samael was obsessed with his machinations, manipulations that spanned centuries and family lines. Dynasties raised to vaulted heights only to be devastated by their own hubris in some poetic way. The Archon was an expert at creating high drama, but in the end, he really wasn't that dramatic himself. The angel of death was skilled and efficient, matter-of-fact, and to the point. Case in point, my welcome to the realm. Barely able to string sentences together on my own, I was led by my mother into the cave where the shaman of our village said the devil dwelled. His confusion had given way to horror when he realized why his mother had taken him there. "He is yours," she announced once they were deep enough inside for the light to be little more than a grey shroud. "In exchange for an end to the black throat." He would never forget the tone of her voice, cold and hard, but with a brittle quality, like the crust of frost that forms on snow after several days of freeze. His limbs absorbed the cold, and he'd shivered unexpectedly. Maz had frozen as shadows formed themselves into a cloaked figure who seemed to walk out of a gloom he'd been a part of only a moment before. Maz's mother gave him a shove forward, and he'd looked back over his shoulder, his eyes begging her to enfold him into her warm arms and take him from this waking nightmare. Her expression was hard, her eyes staring ahead at the creature that was reaching out for Maz. She never looked his way again, not when the being clamped a hand around his small wrist and drew him into the shadows. Moments later, he'd found himself in a world where the grey haze in the air had hit his lungs like a blow, and he'd staggered and coughed, his vision struggling to adjust to the dim surroundings. Broken columns and tumbled ruins seemed to surround him, shrouded figures weaving through the debris as if part of a strange, synchronized dance. It wasn't a dance, he realized, a moment later, when he saw that they were all linked together by an elaborate system of intricate chains that were connected to rings pierced through their flesh, dragging them along through an obstacle course of toppled towers and uneven walkways. Then he'd heard the screams, so loud and pitiful that he'd rushed to cover his ears. The cloaked figure had released his hand and pushed back the hood that had obscured his features. Maz was surprised to find a handsome, angular face beneath it, topped by hair so blonde it was nearly white. Red eyes bored into him, and young Maz had felt the heaviness of the moment in the weight of his gaze. "You won't forget this moment, boy," Samael told him roughly. "The moment your own blood traded you away to the devil to save their own selfish skins." The angel of death had smiled at him then, revealing a pair of long white fangs. Maz swatted the memory from his mind, barely registering the faint annoyance he felt every time he trod the same ground over and over again. That had been Samael's intent, to burn the moment into his psyche in a way that would scar him for eternity. It was a job well done, but that didn't mean Maz had to appreciate the prince's mastery. "I've lived in worshipful fear long enough, haven't I?" Things had started to feel different after the long centuries of being the Arshan's lackey, doing his boss's bidding without the opportunity to refuse. Maz had never felt the weight of eternity like he did now. Millennia after Samael had turned him. An endless monotony of torture, pain, misery. Even if I'm the one inflicting it, on a long enough timeline, it still gets boring. There has to be something more. The image of a fiery-haired temptress with eyes that reminded him of the jungles of his homeland appeared in his head, and his muscles clenched with need. Frustration overwhelmed him, and he looked down to find his fingernails expanding into claws that struck sparks against the stone while he walked down the corridor toward the iron door that marked the most secure section of the keep. Taking a breath to calm himself, his claws retracted, and Maz took a moment to straighten his attire, readying himself for the confrontation ahead. How I long for her scent, that enchanting whiff of innocence and sunlight. Ache burned inside him. Maz remembered the first time he'd seen her. The crescent moon had hung overhead, its white glow seeming to illuminate her perfect skin. He'd known the moment he laid eyes on her that the woman was his mate. It was a terrifying and intoxicating notion, both wonderful and terrible, knowing that his life was destined to be entwined with another, their lifeblood weaving together, two becoming one. But he'd not been able to consider the romantic and philosophical aspects of matehood in that moment. Instinct had taken over, that instinct screaming at him to claim his mate as quickly as possible and never let her go. And thanks to my impeccable luck, I've hit on the most impossible female in the multiverse. I can't claim what I can't find. His anger flared, filling him with righteous rage. Ready to do what needed to be done, he opened the heavy door with a violent flick of his wrist. He tried not to think about the fact that the human had disappeared shortly after he found her. Sure, I might have fumbled our introduction a little, but surely that wasn't enough to drive her away permanently. But she'd vanished, a neat trick for a human. That race was known to be magic-deprived and intellectually backwards. Still, she'd somehow managed to avoid him for weeks, until he'd stumbled onto her dream and discovered her location. The Fae realm of Valencia was a surprise, to be sure, and not a good one, since off-worlders could not enter the realm without being detected. So Maz had hastened to the Rough, a dimension linked to Valencia, to figure out how to reach the human, but she'd nearly come to him. He'd smelled her on a Fae and almost managed to get close, but the situation hadn't shaken out like he'd planned once again. And that's what brings me here, he thought, his eyes on the rusted bars that lined the cell of the prisoner before him. Maz turned his mind from the longing that was slowly consuming him to the figure chained to the wall across from him. Unlike those in cells throughout the hall of punishment, the captive wasn't crying or begging. He was smiling. "I wondered when you'd be back for another chat," he said convivially. "This place isn't exactly flush with stimulating conversation, you know." "Are you trying to say that you missed me?" The prisoner barked out a laugh at Maz's sardonic question. "I guess I am. You're the only company I've had in this place, after all. Still, for accommodations, it's not half bad." Maz held back a sigh. "You can't tell me you're eager for another round of heartless torture. Aren't you tired of it yet?" The figure shook his head. "There are worse things I could be doing, like following behind your boss like a little toady, jumping whenever he crooks a finger." The prisoner looked him over. "Besides, it looks like you have that job sewed up." Maz shrugged his shoulders. "Beats hanging around all day." The captive laughed, a deep belly laugh that had his handsome face turning red. "Oh, that was a good one. I have to say, for a leech, you're not half bad." "And for an imp, you're an idiot." The prisoner laughed again, then made a show of trying to wipe the tears away from his eye, but not being able to thanks to the chains. Maz's tone turned serious. "Why are you doing this, Dallin?" he asked again. There was silence, save for the sound of the prisoner's chains clinking softly against one another as he adjusted his position. "You know, I've thought about that question for a long time. Hells, all we have is time, am I right?" When Maz didn't nod, the figure seemed to deflate a little. "I don't want this life any more," he said simply after a moment, then turned his head to stare at the wall. His earlier jovialness diminished. "We all have our roles to play," Maz said softly, his tone as close to conciliatory as it got. "Destiny makes the rules, not us." "The same destiny that links you to a woman who refuses to be yours," the captive retorted. "I'm sorry, Leech, but I refuse to be pushed around by destiny. I'll leave you to the chase after your precious destiny like a dog in heat." His rage returned in that moment, and Maz's fangs flashed in the dim light. "I'm ready to punish," he thought as he stepped toward the imp draped in chains before he lost the ability to think. Chapter 1. She woke suddenly, her hands clutching at the sheets as the memory of a pair of white fangs followed her into the daylight. Breathing hard, Hollie pulled herself into a sitting position, her back resting against an ornate wooden headboard. She gathered her thoughts, willing the remnants of the dream to fade. Birdsong and the golden morning light helped drive the ghost of the vampire's grip away, and Hollie stood, trudging from the plush bed toward the bathroom. It had taken a little time to get used to the facilities in alternate realms, but the luxury of its area was already becoming normal to her. Although the accommodations were top-notch, Hollie couldn't help missing her own home. It might not be as lavish as the palace of the Fae Queen, but it was hers. She washed up, wondering if she'd ever see Earth again. "I wasn't cut out for a life on the run," she told her reflection as she fingered an imaginary wrinkle on her face and searched her head for gray hairs. Hollie was far too young to find any, but with the level of stress she'd been subjected to lately, she wouldn't have been shocked to find her whole head had turned white overnight. Padding back into the bedroom, she opened a closet and reached inside. Not caring what color of pastel dress was pulled out, each one was impeccably embroidered and painstakingly formed from intricate, expensive fabrics. Hollie tugged on one, then pulled a comb through her hair before stuffing her feet into slippers and entering the airy hallway outside her suite. As she strolled down the hallway, she returned the nods of the industrious Fae, who kept the palace humming along, kept the towels clean and the wash basins filled. Hollie imagined this was what it was like to stay at one of the fancy, all-inclusive resorts she'd never had the chance to visit. All of her needs were catered to, and she'd never have to lift a finger. It was nice, but it wasn't what she was used to. Growing up in a small town in Wisconsin, there hadn't been many tropical-style resorts to speak of. Our father's idea of a vacation consisted of a weekend spent on Lake Winnebago fishing for bass and walleye. The accommodations had been less than stellar, although when she turned 12, she had graduated to her own dome tent. Even then, it was still staked close enough to her father's tent to hear his snores. Comparing her old sleeping bag and campfire fare like hot dogs and marshmallows to the delights of the Fae Royal Palace was laughable. She was outclassed to the nth degree, but a part of her longed to be in that musty tent under the Midwestern stars, her dad snoring in rhythm to the chirping of the crickets and frogs. Even if she would trade in all this luxury to be back there, Hollie couldn't be sure that the swap didn't come with a non-refundable vampire. The arched entry to the dining hall was massive enough for an elephant to stride through, and she suddenly felt small crossing through it. Tables filled the room, half of them occupied by staff, functionaries, and minor nobles. There was another dining chamber, the royal one occupied by the Fae Queen and her king, where greater nobles could be granted audiences. Although Hollie had a standing invitation to the formal dining room, she preferred this one, finding it more comfortable to blend in with the common Fae. A hand waved frantically in her direction. It was attached to a beautiful brunette Fae who greeted her with the usual over-the-top enthusiasm. "What's shaking, Bacon?" the Fae asked, her head bobbing and eyebrows twitching in Hollie's direction. "I get it," Hollie said politely. "A breakfast-based greeting, right?" The Fae called Taylor nodded excitedly. "Bacon being a common breakfast food in your realm, except where forbidden by one of your panoply of gods. Did I perform the greeting correctly?" A shrug was Hollie's reply. "I suppose so. Although we usually just say good morning where I'm from." Taylor stiffened slightly, her smile slipping at the response. The Fae considered herself the foremost human expert among her people, and she'd been delighted at Hollie's arrival in her home realm. She'd followed her to the Fae realm of Queen Elspeth and had been picking her brain ever since, asking esoteric questions about human culture that were starting to wear on Hollie. But that didn't mean she wanted to hurt the Fae's feelings. She reached across the table and patted her hand. "Did I ever tell you about something called the Baconator?" Taylor leaned forward, eyes widening, her enthusiasm returning. "What's that? Some kind of genetically modified swine-based killing machine?" Hollie laughed, some of her gloom fading. "You'd think, but in actuality—" Her explanation was interrupted by the sudden arrival of 2 steaming mugs of tea that appeared out of nowhere on the table between them. She started, instinctively clutching her chest in reaction. Her body, keyed up by her nightmare of the vampire, had told her she was under threat. She let out a frustrated burst of breath when she realized it was only tea. Hollie's eyes found the young Fae woman dressed in the attire of a palace servant, who waved at her with a helpful smile. "I don't know if I'll ever get used to that," Hollie said, begrudgingly tugging the mug toward herself. "Things just popping up out of thin air unexpectedly," she said, shaking her head, her tone tinged with disapproval. "That's another human expression I don't understand," Taylor said, reaching into a pocket in her dress to pull out a little leather-bound notebook. Snatching the pencil she kept tucked into her long hair, she licked the end of it, then held it against the paper expectantly. "What exactly is thin air?" Hollie held in a sigh. Taylor was constantly asking her what this word or that phrase meant. "At least this one's in English," she thought, then admitted to the Fae that she had no idea where the saying had come from. This time she didn't even venture a guess. Just picked up her tea and sipped it, staring off into space. "Home illness?" Taylor asked after a moment, setting her notebook down. "Sickness," Hollie corrected half-heartedly. "And I guess you could say that's correct, but it's more than that. Can you still be homesick for a place if you can never go back there? If it's never going to be your home again?" The questions came out, a momentary lapse in Hollie's usual positive demeanor. So much had happened since she'd first left Earth. Her abduction, a slave auction, fleeing across worlds in fear of being caught by someone powerful and terrible and intent on harm. Her reaction to the situation had been to put on a brave face, to try and focus on the positives instead of the overwhelming number of negatives in her circumstances. Otherwise, she might give up hope of ever seeing her home again. But as the days passed and her nights trapped her in unending nightmares of the creature pursuing her, hope was feeling more and more like a diminishing resource. Her Fae companion gave her a look of understanding. Anyone in your place would be pining for home, too. I wondered how long you would be content to live in the twins' realm. The web can be overwhelming, especially to a human. It doesn't matter if I pine or not. I can't go back there. The chances of running into that vampire are too high. If he followed me to the outskirts of Valencia, what's to stop him from walking into my house and helping himself to a vein? Vampires aren't all powerful, Taylor replied. And you have powerful friends. Hollie nodded. I don't want to sound ungrateful. Lena and Gilly have been the most welcoming of hosts. And this place, it's incredible. She meant her words. Her hostesses here, twin daughters of the Fae Queen, were kind and generous and fun to be around, and although they'd told her to stay as long as she liked, Hollie felt like an interloper. But since their weddings, they've been wrapped up in their guise, which they should be, she hastened to add. But I'm starting to feel like a third wheel. Taylor's face screwed up in a confusion. Third wheel? She drew the shape of a wheel in the air, her fingertip lighting up to leave a shimmering line in the air hanging between them, then shook her head. It's an expression meaning you feel like you're intruding on a couple who would prefer to be alone, because you only need 2 wheels to get where you're going, not 3. I thought vehicles have 4 wheels, Taylor muttered, then perked up. Unless we're talking about a chariot. Is that what you mean? You're getting too bogged down in the metaphor, Hollie said, snatching Taylor's hand out of the air, where it was now sketching the shape of a chariot. They should have their space, the honeymoon period, and I need to figure out what happens next. What do you want to happen? Taylor asked gently. Hollie's look was far away as she imagined returning to her life the way it had been before magic and mystery had invaded and thrown everything into chaos. A simple life, an ordered one, where she knew what to expect at the beginning of the day, and she could make it to her bed that night without being chased by monsters. Home. They've offered you a home here, Taylor reminded her softly. The Fae realm takes some getting used to, but you'll never want for anything. You'll be comfortable, protected, and welcome in all the best houses in the realm. You could build a life for yourself. There are worse places to be stranded. Don't I know it, Hollie said, then let out a wistful sigh. I'm appreciative, I really am. But if there's a chance to go back to my old life, I want to take it. It must have been a good life, Taylor said with a gentle smile. Hollie frowned, looking inward. It was, wasn't it? Chapter 2. 3 months earlier. You better get moving, Miss Applebaum. The sun will be setting soon, and you know how hard it is to drive at night. The old woman looked up at Hollie through glasses with lenses that seemed an inch thick. She blinked twice, then the corners of her eyes crinkled as she grinned. You're such a sweet girl. She patted Hollie's hand twice, then dug her keys out of a purse that likely weighed 10 pounds. Tell your father I said to give you a raise. Thank you, Mrs. Applebaum, Hollie replied dutifully, ignoring the pang of sadness at the mention of her father. You take care. She watched as the old woman toddled into the parking lot, debating whether she should have reminded her that her father, Frank Townsend, was no longer with them. Mrs. Applebaum had seemed a little frailer lately and a lot more forgetful. Hollie made a mental note to stop in at the library where Cindy, Mrs. Applebaum's granddaughter and Hollie's former classmate, worked at the circulation desk. A little chat about her grandmother's health is in order. Watching the old lady's station wagon pull out of the lot and onto Main Street, Hollie rested her chin on her hand and sighed. What if there's something wrong? Mrs. Applebaum isn't getting any younger, and neither are any of my other clients. Her father had built up a reputable insurance agency in the same office building over the last 30 years. An aneurysm had taken him from her suddenly last year, leaving Hollie alone in the small house they'd shared. And in charge of the business he built, one that is dwindling as its client base joins him in the great beyond. Most were as old as Mrs. Applebaum, who'd already seen 80, retirees whose children and grandchildren didn't see the necessity of seeing an in-person insurance agent when they could make changes to their policies through an app on their phones. The business might be providing a living now, but in 5 years, maybe 7, I'll barely be holding on. Her phone rang, interrupting her fretting. She saw that it was Kelly, her neighbor and occasional friend, and debated ignoring the call. Kelly only called when she wanted a favor, and Hollie wasn't really in a favor-granting mood, but after another 2 rings, she relented and pressed the green button to connect the call. "Hey, girl, I thought you'd be home by now. The agency closes at 6, just like every day for the past 30-odd years." She tried to keep the stimminess out of her tone, but wasn't sure if she'd done a great job. Kelly didn't seem to notice. "Do you have a few eggs and some bread I can borrow?" It was harder to hold her tongue this time. Most people borrowed those things from the market, not their neighbor. Kelly and she might not be as close as they'd been when they were girls, but Hollie's memories of those better times prompted her to be patient. "In my fridge. Use the key under the mat." "I don't know why you even bother with a key at all," Kelly said breezily. "Watoma isn't exactly known for its vicious gangs." Rolling her eyes, Hollie realized she needed to end the call for her own sanity. Kelly had a way of reminding her that she wasn't living some sort of cosmopolitan lifestyle, as much as she might dream otherwise. "I guess I'm practicing for when I finally move away to the big city and start my life for real." Laughter blasted from the phone. "Keep dreaming, girl. You're stuck here like the rest of us. You should have gotten out after high school when you could." "You know what? I just remembered I'm out of eggs and bread. Talk to you later, Kelly." She hung up the phone and repressed a curse. Kelly always managed to get on her nerves, her no-filter style having grated since middle school when she decided to ditch Hollie, who had braces and pigtails, for the cool clique, crushing Hollie's self-esteem in the process. She hadn't even come to Hollie's mother's funeral, despite their being neighbors since they were born. Kelly was still her neighbor, she and her live-in boyfriend having claimed the second story of her parents' house next to Hollie's own. Kelly wasn't pleased by the arrangement, endlessly complaining about how hard it was to live at home, but apparently it wasn't hard enough to prompt her to gainful employment and moving out. "She's not right," Hollie grumbled to herself, gathering her things and switching off lights around the office. "I'm not stuck here." Even as she said the words, anxiety filled her. When most of her friends had gone off to college, Hollie had stuck around Watoma, not having the heart to leave her father behind. He'd been mourning her mother's death, the wound still raw years later, and she'd worried that he would slide into a deeper depression if she left too. So Hollie had stayed, working at her father's side and putting her dream life on hold. "I could go home and pack my bags tonight," she told herself. It would be easy enough to get a job in Chicago in one of the insurance conglomerates' corporate offices. I'd find a cute apartment and make some real friends, visit museums, have dinner at fancy restaurants, be able to shop past 6 o'clock in a town that doesn't roll up its sidewalks at sunset. Watoma didn't have much in the way of nightlife, nor were jobs plentiful. When manufacturing had moved out of the Midwest, her town's factory going along with it, there wasn't much to offer in these parts. Successive generations had graduated high school and moved away, and now it was rare to see a young adult older than 12. Which is one of the reasons I've never had a real boyfriend. It was time to move on. There was nothing holding her anymore, nothing but memories. Her mind made up to finally make a change, Hollie set the alarm and locked the building. Heading toward her car, a sudden commotion in the alley beside the building made her pause. The raccoons were back, she thought as she moved closer to the source of the noise, assuming it was the pair of ring-tailed beggars who'd managed to work their wiles on her father.
he'd leave them strawberries and grapes as a treat, despite Hollie's warnings not to feed the wildlife or risk encouraging their bad habits. Frank Townsend was a soft touch, however, and soon the 2 raccoons were regular visitors to the trash cans in the alley outside the office. Scanning the dim confines of the alley, her brows furrowed when she didn't see any of the bandit-faced beasts. A breeze ruffled her hair, and Hollie shivered, then started when she saw a shadowy figure seem to step from the darkest recess of the alley. Deja vu washed over her for no reason she could understand. Eyes flashed in the darkness, locking onto her, and in that moment she was frozen to the spot. The figure took a step toward her, and her mind told her to run, to get out of there before the shadow resolved itself into a real person with real intentions. But she couldn't move, couldn't do anything but watch him walk closer. Footsteps rang out against the concrete, echoing in the confines of the alley, but Hollie could barely hear them over the pounding of her own heart. She'd never felt this looming sense of danger before. Not in Watoma, where the biggest crime to happen in the last decade had been when a group of high schoolers had defaced the mural on the exterior wall of the public library. Adrenaline surged through her, but she couldn't flee. "I have to see him." Without warning, the lid of the dumpster flung itself open suddenly. The figure stopped, turning in the direction of the noise, and the spell was broken. Hollie let out a ragged breath, her eyes flicking to the open lid, but there was nothing there. There was a clanging sound like someone stepping on the metal of the other lid, then what she thought was footsteps hitting the ground, but the space around the dumpster was empty. There's no one else there. So what's making all that noise? The footsteps belonging to no one pattered off down the alley in the opposite direction until they were too far away to hear. Hollie's gaze returned to where the shadowy figure had been, but there was nothing there. She was alone. She shivered, then hurried to her car, locking the door behind her. It took a while for her heart to stop pounding, and she closed her eyes and focused on her breathing. What was that? Hollie had never felt anything like that before. The sensation of déjà vu, as if she somehow knew the figure who had been approaching her, was uncanny. But she knew almost everyone in Watoma, and no one was that tall, or had such broad shoulders. And those eyes, the way they'd shone. He was definitely a stranger to these parts. But what would a stranger be doing creeping down the alley next to her insurance office at night time? And what were the noises she'd heard? Noises that seemed like an invisible man was fleeing from the shadow creature. Shadow creatures, invisible men. Hollie let out a nervous laugh, trying to convince herself she was being ridiculous. How melodramatic can you get? You'd be worse off than Mrs. Applebaum if you believe that really happened. She started the car and headed slowly out of the parking lot, forcing herself to try and shake the lingering disquiet. This is Watoma. Nothing interesting happens here, and strangers are few and far between. Isn't it more likely that your brain just conjured a figure out of shadows? But what about the dumpster lid? She argued with herself. I saw it fly up on its own. The wind? The rational part of her mind countered. Isn't that more logical than an invisible man? Right, she said, considering herself convinced. The wind. And shadows. Like 4th grade, when I spent the entire year terrified of the shadow of my jacket. In the dark of night, she'd been sure the long jacket that lived on a hook on the back of her door was actually a monster who'd come to life at any second to devour her. The ride home was short. The small house she'd inherited from her father less than 5 minutes away. By the time she reached it, she'd forced the incident out of her mind, trying to summon the urge she'd felt while locking up the office. Hollie told herself that she'd fix a quick dinner, then spend the night packing up her closet. Tomorrow it was time to start sending out her resume. Flicking on the kitchen light, she headed for the fridge, deciding to make some French toast for dinner. It was a dish her father had perfected, and one he'd always made before they'd start an arduous task. Opening her fridge, Hollie scanned the contents and frowned. The loaf of bread was missing, and so was the carton of eggs. She shut the door and collapsed into a chair at the small kitchen table. Kelly, she grumbled, knowing that her neighbor was the culprit of her grocery theft. All the gumption went out of her. Her fingers buried themselves in her hair as she rested her forehead in her hands. In that moment, all she could think about was the mess she'd made of her life. Maybe Kelly is right. Maybe I am stuck here. Maybe this is all I deserve. Looking back on this time in the sumptuous dining room in the marvelous Fae realm, Hollie realized two things. That was the first moment I saw the vampire. And I would give anything to be back in that small house in that little Wisconsin town right now. It might have been a boring life, but it was mine. She was no longer in charge of her own destiny. I won't even be in control of my own body if that vamp has his way. Tears swelling in her eyes, Hollie knew she'd never felt so defeated.
Chapter 3. Hollie blinked back to the present to find Taylor's arms wrapped around her. The Fae had crossed behind and enfolded her in a warm embrace.
I understand home illness very well. I can't imagine being cut off from my home. But something I've learned in my travels as the Fae's foremost authority on human affairs is that friends help the illness recede. It doesn't go away altogether, but friends make it easier. And you are surrounded by friends.
Wiping her eyes, Hollie gave her a watery smile.
Thank you, Taylor.
I do have friends, ones I value greatly.
And ones who can help you, protect you. Trust me, the vamp would have to be insane to come after you here. Queen Elspeth and King Lear would obliterate him, not to mention the damage Lena and Gilly would do. You're safe here.
Sniffling, Hollie nodded. That fact I'm definitely grateful for. What's going on here? A melodic voice asked, and Hollie turned her head to see Lena's face filled with concern. Her twin Gilly was 2 steps behind her, her expression identical. What troubles you? Oh, I was just recalling your wedding ceremony, Hollie said, adopting the tone she'd used on her clients at the agency when conversation became too personal. It was such a beautiful day, and you both looked so happy. Taylor's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't out Hollie to the other Fae. Lena's face broke into a breathtaking smile, and Gilly let out a little laugh of delight. No reason to get all teary-eyed, the other twin chastised. This one tied herself to a droopy-eared soldier for eternity. If anyone should be crying, it's my sister. Lena stuck out her tongue at her twin. Says the girl who married a monster. Hollie could feel some of her sadness fading. Her lips quirked up, though she felt a pang of regret at not opening up to the women. Lena and Gilly had been through a tremendous struggle to save their kingdom and their own family in the process. Hollie's issue with the vampire seemed trivial in comparison, so she held her tongue and pretended to be unconcerned about her plight in their presence. You both could have done better. This came from Phaedra, who was striding toward them, her wings never failing to turn heads. Although everyone in the realm was descended from a common ancestor, the descendants of Queen Elspeth lacked wings, while Taylor and Phaedra, residents of another Fae realm known as Valencia, had shimmering gold lace wings that were both delicate and powerful. The warrior woman coming their way intimidated Hollie, although she was beyond grateful to have met her. Phaedra had kept her safe and Araman abad, a hellscape that had done its best to destroy them. She peered down at Hollie, arching an eyebrow. What's upsetting you? She asked, her tone a little harsh. Nothing, Hollie said, injecting false cheer into her voice. I guess I'm just a little emotional today. Phaedra's nose wrinkled, and she eyed the other Fae, a look of mistrust on her face. Who's upset the human? You know they're fragile, and not just physically. Gilly dismissed her question with a wave of a hand. No one said anything. She was reminiscing over our wedding. The warrior Fae snorted. It's hilarious. What humans think merits tears, don't you think? Taylor shot her companion a dark look. Typical Fae superiority. Just because humans have different emotional depths, that doesn't mean they deserve your ridicule. She put an arm around Hollie's shoulder in a protective gesture. Sometimes I think our long lives cause us to lose some of our emotional intensity. Put yourself in someone else's shoes sometime. Phaedra's mouth flattened into a line. Thank you for the lecture, Professor. But I'm content with my emotions. Or lack thereof, Gilly said out of the side of her mouth, making the winged Fae's eyes flash with anger. Phaedra put her hands on her hips, giving them all a look that said they were lucky she was tolerating them. I think we could all use some tea, Lena said, as the peacemaker, snapping her fingers to summon more steaming mugs. Shepherding the women to the table, she managed to get them settled down. Phaedra blew over her mug, then took a sip. Her face made a mar at the taste, but she refrained from reminding them that Valencian tea was better. She couldn't remain silent, however. If we stick around here much longer, I'm going to insist that we plant some leaves from Valencia. It couldn't hurt to diversify your stock. Lena and Gilly looked at each other while Taylor hid her face in embarrassment. You're welcome to stay as long as you like, Lena said, smiling in Hollie's direction. Stay forever if you like. Hollie opened her mouth to thank her for the invitation, but Phaedra's groan interrupted her. Forever is a mighty long time, and in my opinion, we've been here too long already. Nobody asked for your opinion, Taylor grumbled. They were talking to all of us. You can stay as long as you like, Phaedra said. But Hollie and I should be getting back to Valencia. I have duties to attend to. Then you go, Taylor said, making a shooing motion. Hollie and I can continue our conversations just fine without you. Phaedra grunted. Humans are fragile creatures. They need protecting. Hollie's hands tightened into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She was tired of being labeled as fragile, even if she wasn't as powerful as the other races she'd run into in the web. I've been treated like a child long enough, she thought, her father sheltering of her running right into Phaedra's overprotectiveness. Enough is enough. We are more than capable of keeping Hollie safe, Gilly said stiffly. If visiting here is keeping you from your duties, I agree with your compatriot. You should return to Valencia and your commitments. Phaedra gave Gilly a speaking look. I know we had our differences on Valencia, but... Your differences? Lena blustered. You tried to have her husband executed. He wasn't her husband then, Phaedra corrected, just before Lena continued her tirade, reminding her about the false prophecy and all the trouble the Prince of Valencia had caused. Things quickly devolved into a heated discussion, and Hollie rubbed her temples, unhappy at the direction the day was going in. I want to go home, she said suddenly, slapping her hands against the wooden table. The Fae gathered around her fell silent. Then all started talking again at once. But what about the vampire? Lena asked. At the same time, her twin said, You're on the run, remember? That means staying away from home. But it was Phaedra's bark of laughter that burned the worst. Out of the question, the warrior woman said. That leech will have his fangs buried in your neck in minutes if you go back there. Hollie held up her hands defensively. I know it's not safe, but it's what I want. She turned to look at Lena and Gilly, her smile well-meaning. You are so kind to invite me to stay, and I am beyond thankful, but I don't fit in here. It just takes time, Lena insisted. I know how it is to feel like an outsider, but the feeling will go away after a while, once you get used to life here. I don't think she wants to get used to life here, Gilly said gently, taking her sister's hand. I remember how badly I wanted to come home, and if I hadn't been able to, if I'd had to stay in Ahrimanabad, nothing would have made me feel better. But how can she go home? Lena asked. Phaedra is right. The vampire will know she's there and will come for her. She needs protection. She does, Gilly said, scratching her head. But maybe we're not considering all the options. There may be some magical way of protecting her. Something to mask her from the vampire so he won't know she's there. How are you going to do that? Phaedra asked, her tone doubtful. I'm not sure Fae magic can help you with that. Masking someone in the Fae realm, sure, but not in the human world. I know someone who might be able to help, Taylor perked up, a smile spreading across her lovely face. I met a witch once, at the birthday party of a significant human. Witches are known for their spellcasting ability. Witches are unpredictable, Phaedra countered. Besides, they're almost as fragile as humans are. They're no match for a vampire. Witches have powers that can sometimes surpass our own, Gilly pointed out. We shouldn't discount them without considering them as an option. If Hollie wants to go home, we should help her get there. Hollie could see the heat rising in Phaedra's cheeks. She and Gilly had a way of getting on each other's nerves, and it looked like this was shaping up to be a blowout. Phaedra, she said in a gentle tone, reaching out for the Fae,
I know that you only want what is best for me, and I thank you for that, but going home is what's best for me. You said it yourself. You have duties to attend to, and so do I. If I can find a way for me to get home safely, will you help me?" Phaedra let out a heavy breath, her expression broadcasting that she really didn't want to answer in the affirmative. A moment later, though, she softened. "I will, but we have to be absolutely positive that the leech won't be able to find you before I agree to leave you alone on Earth." "That settles it," Taylor said, excitement in her voice. "Now we just need to get ourselves to Margay, where the witch has an office."
"Witches have offices?" Hollie said, confused.
"Does this mean warlocks carry briefcases?" Taylor shrugged. "Some do, I suppose. You've got to keep your spell ingredients somewhere."
Hollie laughed, but Phaedra wasn't in a jovial mood.
"She's in Margay?
That's unincorporated territory." "Margay is a market realm," Gilly corrected. "It's shared by a consortium of vendors. They pay for their own security."
"Security?" the warrior Fae scoffed. "They're little better than boys with wooden swords pretending to be soldiers." "We'll be bringing our own security forces," Lena told her. "Bracken and Solomon won't let anything get close to us."
"We're no slouches either," Gilly backed her up. "Between the four of us, Fae, we're enough to stop an army of pretend soldiers."
"Great!" Taylor leapt up from the table, clapping her hands together. "What say we go now? I'm sure your folks will let us use the palace portal, right?"
Hollie knew that Queen Elspeth and King Lear had commissioned a new trans-realm portal in their palace to restart relations with Valencia, as well as open the Fae realm up to other worlds once again. The Fae realm had always allowed off-worlders, but they were few and far between, especially considering the tension between the cities and the Fae Wilds, which had once been at odds. After the king and queen had united, however, the realm was safe for visitors again.
"I think Mother will allow it," Lena said.
"Selling it to our husbands will likely be the trickiest part." "Don't worry," Gilly said, nudging her sister with her elbow. "I think we have something they might want, if you know what I mean." She ran her hands through the air, creating an hourglass shape and waggling her eyebrows. Lena blushed, but Taylor burst out laughing.
"Don't go through any extra trouble on my account," Hollie said, joining in on the joke.
Her spirits were starting to rise for the first time in a while, and she felt lighter. Lena dropped a wink.
"Trouble was never so much fun."
Chapter 4. She lifted a hand to scratch an itch near her shoulder, then realized a large hairy spider was making its way up her arm. Hollie's eyes widened, and she was a second away from screaming, but Gilly saw what was happening and gently removed the creature, setting it atop a stack of moldering papers.
"Thank you,"
Hollie mouthed, and the Fae nodded in reply.
"As I was saying, I can't thank you enough for all your help getting my fledgling business off the ground. I live and die by referrals, and bringing such esteemed individuals here for assistance is really a boon."
Taylor nodded in acknowledgement.
"Hollie needs help," she said simply, "and we all hope you're able to provide it."
"So am I." The woman behind the desk beamed, tucking an unruly curl behind her ear. She had dark hair and eyes, and a disheveled appearance.
"This is a witch?"
Hollie thought, thinking she looked like a regular old human who preferred to buy her clothing at thrift stores whose donors were exclusively into velvet and black lace.
"An endorsement from the twin powerhouses of the Fae realm would really put me into orbit. You know, you're the talk of the multiverse at the moment."
Lena and Gilly looked at each other, then burst out laughing.
"Please don't let my husband hear you say that,"
Lena told her, eyeing the shop window. On the other side, two tall, broad-shouldered males were posted, relentlessly scanning. Phaedra scoffed from her place on a stool near the door, her nose in the air.
"There's a little matter of a successful spell, so all this talk of recommendations is premature." "Of course," Cass said with a little cough, picking up a stack of papers and straightening them. "It's just, I'm not your typical witch for hire. Our business practices are so antiquated, you'd think we employed our familiars to capture market share for us." She tittered, then made a little frown when her joke didn't get a response.
Hollie leaned back, a little concerned. The image of a cat wearing a tiny black pointed witch's hat and buying stocks on a laptop flitted through her head, and she rubbed her eyes, trying to take things seriously. That's a little hard to do when I'm sitting in a cluttered office surrounded by spell ingredients and scented candles. What even is that thing? Her nose wrinkled as she peered closer at a shape in a rounded vial that sat on Cass's desk. It took her a moment to realize that it was a goat's eye. Surrounding the golden disc slit by black was white fur. It was a macabre sight, and Hollie let out a gasp when the eye suddenly blinked.
You see, I'm blazing a new path, so to speak, in terms of attracting clientele. We witches aren't exactly known for slick branding and advertising engagement. In fact, I'm one of a small few who even has a storefront. She indicated the room around them, crowded with artifacts and smelling a little like a barn to Hollie's senses. Although Cass seemed to be aiming for ultra-modern, her business reminded Hollie of an old travel agency that only booked local tours. I don't think a few recommendations and a hashtag are going to fix this. But as you can see, bringing our practices into the modern age can mean a broader clientele. Not only does that mean greater profits, but it also brings the benefits of Hecataean magic to more realms. Win-win.
Taylor nodded hopefully, but Phaedra waved her hand in a circular motion, wanting the witch to move on.
I'm less interested in your strategic plan than in your abilities. We need to be able to hide our friend here from a vampire stalker. What kind of spells do you have that can keep her from being detected by the leech?
Cass's eyes widened.
A vampire stalker, that is a unique issue.
She squinted in Hollie's direction, then started.
You're human.
Hollie nodded.
Is that going to be a problem?
The witch shook her head.
It's an unexpected development, but it shouldn't affect the magic.
She rose to reach for a book on the shelf beside her. Sitting again, she blew the dust off the cover, then cracked it, flipping through the pages.
As a human, your lack of magic will actually work in your favor.
I think a masking spell coupled with one of my standard protection plans is the way to go.
Protection plan,
Phaedra said, crossing her arms.
What does that entail exactly?
Well, we place a ring of protection around your choice of domicile, the square footage determining the strength of the spell and the expense of setting the ring. That ring is guaranteed to repel any creature that is not of the source realm.
Meaning anyone that isn't human?
Taylor shook her head.
I want to be able to visit Hollie, and I'm certain my companions feel the same way. Is there any way to alter the ring?
Cass let out a breath.
There is, but we're talking about very complicated hexes here. The prices go up for every exception.
Exception? Lena looked skeptical. Does that mean each person who is allowed to enter the ring or each race? We could leave the ring open for all Fae.
And have the leech enthrall one of your own to get past the ring? I don't think so.
Phaedra's tone was combative, and Hollie began to worry she might shoot down every option out of a spiteful abundance of caution.
I could keep the ring by life signature, meaning only individuals who have been selected will be allowed access to Hollie.
Cass pulled out a piece of parchment that was covered in strange light blue symbols. She picked up a piece of black chalk and set about drawing a circle. The ones whose life signatures are recognized can pass through the ring unencumbered, she said, drawing an arrow through the circle to the center. Those whose life signatures aren't recognized, she drew a line that bounced off the edge of the circle and skidded off the page.
No entry.
All of this is well and good, Phaedra said airily, but you haven't yet explained how you plan to keep the vampire from discovering Hollie's location.
Ah, yes,
Cass said, balling up the paper and tossing it over her shoulder. Her mannerisms jerky, she jerked open a drawer and started digging inside it. Pulling out an ivory statue of a maiden with long hair, she set it on a metal tray in front of them. The witch picked up a jar of ink, then tipped it over, letting it coat the figure until it was an unrecognizable blob.
Just like that.
You're going to drown me in ink?
Hollie's chest tightened, her faith in the witch starting to wobble.
Not literally, no. But I'm going to cover you in magic.
The witch said something in a language Hollie didn't understand, and the ink sucked itself back into the bottle, the stopper returning itself with a pop.
My magic will shield you from visibility. But not really, right? I mean, I'm not going to end up an invisible woman, am I? Don't get me wrong. I'm sure being invisible has its advantages, but I'd prefer to live a normal, seen life, at least seen by those who don't mean me harm.
Cass laughed, shaking her head.
I didn't mean to confuse you. You won't be invisible. In fact, to the rest of the people in your realm, nothing will look different about you at all. But to off-worlders, you'll be invisible in the sense that you'll be impossible to locate by magical means.
The vamp already has her address, Phaedra grated. He doesn't need to locate her. He knows where she is. Cass shot the warrior Fae an annoyed look.
Then she moves.
I don't want to move, Hollie piped up. I want to go home. Gilly put an arm around her while Lena patted her hand. I'm sure the witch can find a way, right? The Fae princess asked politely. Cass let out a whistle.
You're asking for a powerful ritual, and ingredients for something like that don't come cheap.
I'm not sure what's given you the impression that we're unable to afford your services, Lena replied, plucking a velvet bag off her belt and turning it over to spill gold coins and jewels onto the witch's desk. I trust this will serve as a good down payment. The witch's eyes widened and her smile was broad and sharp.
You're damn right it will.
With one smooth motion, the witch encircled the money pile with her arm and slid it into the open desk drawer, closing it with a click.
That should buy a fair amount of ingredients.
How do we get started? Gilly asked. Cass shoved things around on her desk until she found a notepad and a pencil.
I'll need you to answer some questions, she said, holding the pencil against the paper. The first one is, how extensive is your list of exceptions?
Hollie half listened as her Fae companions dominated the discussion. Her eyes wandered, wondering if it was natural to feel this disengaged from the process unfolding in the witch's office. They don't seem to need my opinions, she thought, feeling low. I suppose they are the most equipped to handle something like this, though. I have no real knowledge of magic and spells, after all. Her eyes fell on the window and the two males outside. Although she'd spent less time with Bracken and Solomon than she had their brides, Hollie knew she could trust them to watch over her. She'd seen how protective they were of their own wives. As long as I have Gilly and Lena near me, I don't need to worry about anything. I think those two could handle all of Earth's monsters combined. Look out King Kong and say sayonara Godzilla. A Fae soldier and a Dev Raider are on the case. Hollie started when she saw Bracken and Solomon both turn in the same direction. They moved to the right, disappearing from view. What could have attracted their attention enough to leave the storefront? She worried, but she didn't have to wait long for an answer. The bell over the door chimed, and Hollie turned around in her seat to take in the figure walking into the shop. She went rigid with shock as her nightmare became her waking life. He was tall, his chest broad, and his frame powerful. His hair was dark brown with golden highlights, and it was pulled back into a leather thong at the nape of his neck, falling down to the midpoint of his back. But it was his eyes that froze her to the core. When he entered, they were ice blue, but the moment they locked with hers, the pupils turned the deep red of fresh blood. His lips twitched, revealing the tips of his fangs, just a little whiter than his pale skin. He took a step forward, and Hollie let out a scream that echoed around the confines of the small storefront. Lena ducked, slapping her hands over her ears, but Gilly was out of her seat in an instant. Phaedra was faster, however, and she lunged toward the vampire. But he was suddenly gone, no longer in the space he'd been in just a second before. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder and turned, coming face to face with her nemesis. Chapter 5. I have her. It took everything inside him not to clutch her, to pull her into his chest and bury his fangs inside her supple, elegant neck. Instead, Maz lifted a hand to her delicate cheek and stroked it, the softness of her skin reminding him of the petal of a flower. She blushed red, and the blood rising to the surface of her skin had him hanging on to his control by a thread. I need to taste her. But touching her seemed to soothe the worst of the torrent inside him. enabling him to take her in, to observe her up close in a way he hadn't yet been able to. She's gorgeous, he thought, reinforcing the opinion he'd had from the first moment he'd seen her. Her hair crackled like fire, and her green eyes sparkled, her perfect features staring up at him with a mixture of fear and something else, an emotion that vanished before he could name it. It was that unnameable something that filled him with hope for the first time since he'd seen her. "Release her!" came a growl from the Fae whose knife was flashing in his direction. He remembered her from the rough, remembered the scent of Hollie on her skin. He flashed his fangs, knocking away the blade with a quick blow, but it left him barely able to deflect the magical attack that blasted from the identical Fae beside her. Maz's anger exploded, wanting to punish the women for putting his mate at risk with their clumsy attacks. He shoved the human behind him, shielding her with his body, ready to take on the 4 Fae who were now rounding on them, magic crackling at their fingertips. Unfortunately, he forgot about the female behind the desk. A second later, his body lit up with heat, and the room spun around him. He stumbled backwards, hitting a stone wall, then falling on his ass. Maz was on his feet in a flash, realizing that the witch had hit him with a spell of banishment. Letting out a growl of rage, he returned in an instant to his last location, appearing in the witch's shop. Candles still burned, and a few papers ruffled with the wind of his appearance, but the human and her companions were gone. Maz let out a string of curses, then shoved his way out the door, scanning the busy street out front, but he could not catch a glimpse of any of the Fae or his mate. He re-entered the shop and began digging through the piles of random papers that covered several surfaces, hoping to find a clue to their next destination. It had been difficult enough to locate Hollie in this world, and the prospect of starting over was frustrating. Maz had sent out demonic lackeys to hundreds of realms in the web, hoping to stumble on the one where his mate was hiding. When he'd heard about the contingent of Fae traveling with one human and a brutal-looking dev, he knew he'd found her. "I should have stopped to make a plan instead of heading straight for her," he chastised himself as he ripped through desk drawers, his fingernails becoming black-tipped claws to shred and tear. "There's nothing here to give me a clue to her whereabouts." Maz slammed a desk drawer, then fell back into the chair, slamming his fist against the desk. Part of him wanted to destroy the storefront, to pull it apart brick by brick, but he forced himself to conserve energy. "Who knows how many realms I'll have to search to locate her again." Letting out a groan, he stood, approaching the window. He stayed out of the bar of light that came through, avoiding any contact with the sun's rays. Maz had walked the web for millennia, which meant he'd built up enough strength to survive some sunlight without it meaning instant death like it could for a newly turned vampire. But his resistance didn't mean he could walk onto a beach at high noon without protection. He was still very much a creature of night, but if he stuck to the shadows and stayed out of direct sunlight, he was able to move about during daylight hours without risk of injuring himself. Shortly ago, 2 substantial males had stood here guarding the women inside, but he'd managed to create a diversion in the busy market street that drew them away long enough for him to enter the shop without attracting their attention. Although he'd been a match for the women inside, at least for the moments he'd had before the witch banished him, the addition of 2 overprotective, love-addled men to the bunch would have made things even more difficult. But his diversion had netted him nothing in the end, because they'd still managed to escape with his mate. "I can still smell her," he thought, inhaling heavily and then letting out a ragged breath. Her scent was sweet, and it had always reminded him of something he couldn't quite place, but that brought him back to an almost forgotten memory of moonlight over thick jungle. The image flashed in his mind again, but Maz didn't dwell on it. He was eager to take up the hunt once again, eager to finally claim the woman who'd left such an imprint on his soul. Giving up on finding any clues to her whereabouts in the cluttered shop, he flashed back to Pluto, to the office of the Warden of Hell, a self-proclaimed title the creature sitting before him had given himself when he'd wrestled himself to the top of the heap of demon servants. The warden's back was to him, his carrot-colored hair sticking up in unruly tufts. He was big, his body broad and muscular, and his office bordered on an animal's den. Carved out of rock, the ceiling was blackened by the torches that blazed on the walls at all hours. The floor was caked in filth, which, when added to the pitch from the torch tips, and the mammalian musk emanating from the office's inhabitant set up a stink that lazed through the air like scum on a pond. "Any word, Thibault?" The creature started, letting out a roar of surprise that echoed around the chamber. He leapt from his chair and whirled around to face Maz, then let out a huff of disgust. His eyes, which had been filled with golden feline brightness a second ago, returned to brown as his skin seemed to shimmer, one moment covered in hair that matched the shade on his head, striped in black. The tiger shifter gave a growl, returning to his humanoid form after his momentary shift.
"Would it kill you to use the door, leech?"
He motioned Maz to the front of his desk, and for a moment the vampire considered whether to acquiesce to his suggestion. Thibault might consider himself a VIP among Samael's minions, but Maz's own position was much more vaunted. Finally, in the interest of keeping Thibault's assistance in locating his mate, Maz strolled around the desk to stand on the other side. Hands behind his back, Maz's gaze bored into the shifter, who had by now reclaimed his seat. "What have your staff reported? Any signs of the human female?" Thibault arched a dark eyebrow. "One sign, not even half an hour ago. I already shared it with you, remember? She's gone again. No other reports then?"
"You lost her that quickly?"
Thibault's mouth twitched, whiskers appearing for a second only to disappear a moment later. "This girl must be something." Maz scowled down at him. "I want more demons out there looking for her. Now!"
"Get a grip on your fangs, leech,"
Thibault muttered, shuddering. "I've got 100 out there now, searching for you. You'll be updated the moment one finds anything. 100 is not enough. I don't care if you have to empty all 17 hells. Get more demons out there searching." Maz could barely keep a hold on his temper. Being so far away from Hollie made his skin feel too tight. It had only been a matter of minutes since he'd held her, but her touch was already wearing off. Need was returning, crashing over him like a tidal wave. The tiger shifter's eyes narrowed, flashing golden again. "Does Samael know about your little quest to find this mysterious human female?" Maz showed no reaction to his words, but his insides rapidly filled with anger. The angel of death demanded total obedience, which meant mates were forbidden to his servants. He couched the rule as one of control, but Maz had heard darker rumors about Samael's own fated mate having died eons ago. Perhaps the Arshan couldn't stand anyone else being happy when he was cursed to eternal misery. "I want her found," Maz announced, then turned on his heel, this time using the door as Thibault had suggested. He slammed it behind him hard enough to knock it off the hinges. The heavy wooden door shattered, and Maz smiled when he heard the shifter's string of curses following him down the hall. His rage close to boiling over, his feet took him to where he could focus his anger most successfully. The imp looked up, his eyes brightening at the sight of Maz. "Back already? I thought my next torture session wasn't until after dinner." Maz was in no mood for the imp's sass. "Why did you return to Earth after I caught you there? Didn't you think I'd find you again?" Dallin shrugged. "I figured you might not think I'd return to the scene of the crime, so to speak, so soon after you'd caught me there." "But there was a reason for your return, wasn't there?" A theory had been forming in Maz's mind, one that had been gathering steam since their previous encounter. Dallin had mentioned his mate, a secret Maz had desperately been trying to keep. Thibault and his demons could know Maz was looking for a woman, but they were not to know what the woman was to him. "Samael wouldn't hesitate to rip off my limbs and beat me with them if he'd found out I'd been seeking my mate. Or worse, he'd punish her in my stead." Maz couldn't even allow himself to recognize that thought. Samael must never know about her, but somehow Dallin knows. How? The imp watched him carefully. Although he claimed not to fear torture, the glassy look in his eyes told Maz that Dallin knew the vampire was capable of true horrors.
"I saw your reaction to her. Only your mate could keep you from your prey. She bought me precious seconds to escape, and when I managed to get away from you once again, I decided to capitalize on my discovery."
"Capitalize how?" Maz wasn't sure he liked the direction their conversation was headed. It was dangerous even to speak of mates on Pluto. Samael had spies everywhere. "This is boring," The imp burst out suddenly, his expression grouchy. How about some of that torture to pass the time? He's hiding something. Maz stepped closer, his gaze locking onto Dallin's. Tell me what I want to know. As he spoke, his voice roughened, the skill of compulsion wrapping the words in the vampire's will. Not even the imp was immune. I intended to kidnap her and barter her to Ahriman for his collection. His fury exploded, and Maz barely held himself back from ripping Dallin's head from his shoulders. What would drive you to be so reckless? I'm sick of being under Samael's heel, doing the devil's bidding, an eternity of service to a supreme bastard. Where's the fun in that? Maz shook his head in disbelief. That's our fate, he replied simply. Your fate, Dillon growled. I want my freedom, and I would do anything to get it, including barter a vampire's mate in exchange for release from unending servitude. What went wrong? A look of embarrassment crossed the imp's features. I gained her trust enough to get her off-world, but once we were on Ahriman Abad, I lost her in a card game. Maz couldn't believe what he was hearing. Not only did his forsaken imp think he was going to waltz off with his mate, but he planned to use another Prince of Darkness to free him from Samael. You're insane. Are you sure you aren't? Licking Samael's boots like a good doggy? Aren't you tired of being at his beck and call? Don't you want something more? The image of Hollie filled his mind, but he pushed it away. Your plan would never have worked, even if you could avoid my wrath, which is highly doubtful. You'd never get Ahriman to agree to betraying his brother. Are you sure? Dillon's tone held a note of insidiousness. Perhaps instead of chastising me, you should join me. If you want a chance at claiming your mate, you're going to have to break from Samael. He won't allow you to claim her. You know that. Silence, Maz said, hitting the wall beside the imp hard in a fit of spontaneous frustration, causing the stone to crumble there. He knew deep inside that Dallin was correct, but he wasn't ready to confront that reality. You will tell no one what you know, or I will break with Samael long enough to end your endless torture by ripping out the shriveled organ you call a heart and feeding it to you. Awash in rage and disappointment, Maz left, afraid that he'd be provoked to further violence if he remained. Besides, Dallin had confirmed his suspicions. The imp was responsible for my mate's escape. Once he took her to Ahriman Abad, I couldn't have found her even if I was in the same realm as her. Ahriman's magic would see to that. Dallin's warning rang in his ears as he trudged across the ruins to the small dwelling that served as his home on Pluto. He just shut the door behind him when his body was racked suddenly with excruciating pain. In a blink, he found himself tumbling to an obsidian floor laced with amethyst geometric patterns that were so sharp and otherworldly they tended to give him a headache just looking at them. Maz lifted his gaze to find Samael, the angel of death, staring down at him from his throne. He knows, Maz thought, panic filling his mind, but he stood still, not showing a hint of his internal chaos. Samael leaned forward with a frown. How is it that I give you one simple duty and still you cannot fulfill it? I don't know what you mean, my lord. Dallin, he's escaped again. I want him back, and this time his torture will be constant. Go, now. Maz nodded, then teleported away from Samael's audience chamber. Relief flooded him at the realization that Samael had not yet learned of his mate's existence. Maz returned to the chamber that moments ago had held the imp. The chains hung limp against the wall, and Maz stepped closer, his face transforming into a scowl as he fingered a length of broken chain. I'm a fool, he said, realizing that he'd inadvertently broken one of the links when he'd punched the wall in anger. Dallin must have seen it and hid it from me. With a groan, he set off to once again track down the wily imp. Instead of one missing person, now I'm after two. Chapter 6. The trees made her nervous. Not just the trees, Hollie thought, sticking close to Phaedra. They were walking down a dirt path crisscrossed with grey roots that curled and humped in ways that seemed custom-designed to break an ankle. Everything about this place gives me the creeps. They'd had to make a hasty exit from Cass's storefront. The witch hit the vampire with some sort of spell that made him disappear. Then she'd ordered them to link arms and pulled out a gnarled twig and shook it while reciting a slurry of clipped foreign words. With a wave of the twig, Hollie had felt a sensation in her stomach, as if it were trying to get to the ground as quickly as possible. She held on tight, and away they whooshed, landing in a gray, bleak realm of scraggly trees and gloomy fog.
"Are you sure he can't track us here?" The vampire had gotten close enough to touch her in Cass's shop, and she'd stood frozen, waiting to feel the sting of his fangs at her neck. "If my friends hadn't been there to stop him, he would have had me at his mercy, and I couldn't have done a thing to stop him." Hollie didn't understand why she froze whenever the vamp came for her. In her dreams, she was able to break away, to flee him, but in the waking world, her muscles locked into position, like a mouse hypnotized by the serpent just before it strikes. She tried not to think about it, but her nights had turned long and sleepless as she tried to avoid the nightly dreams starring her shadowy stalker. It was impossible to avoid analyzing her situation. "Is there a part of me that wants to be caught?" She shivered, pushing the thought away, thankful when Cass spoke, allaying her fears.
Samothrace is the sacred place of Hecate, ruler of all witches and warlocks, goddess of night and protector of crossroads. None dare trespass in her realm with ill intent.
Phaedra let out a chuckle. "I can't blame them. Have you ever seen the woman?"
"I'd head in the other direction too, if only to escape her stench."
Cass glowered at the warrior Fae, but Hollie was confused until Gilly leaned in to speak softly into her ear. "I haven't seen her myself, but I've heard stories. She's been called the Rotten Goddess because she's said to be in a constant state of decay. The stories say she wears a mask when visiting the others to hide her hideous condition." The witch's hearing was better than the Fae had expected.
"She is the triple-bodied goddess, meaning she can take alternate forms, both beautiful and terrible."
"And stinking to high heavens," Phaedra said under her breath. Hollie could sense that Cass was irritated, and angering a witch didn't sound like a good idea. She brought the topic back to her concerns. "Does that mean Hecate protects the realm? Does she keep people out of the realm who don't belong? Is there some kind of force field, maybe?"
"Force field?" Cass shook her head. "If you mean some form of protection, not exactly. Samothrace has and always shall be an open realm. It has to be in order for the goddess to draw strength from her worshippers. Devotees of Hecate span many realms, and their prayers cannot reach her if she closes off her realm."
"So no force field." Hollie tried not to sound disappointed. "What's to keep the vampire from showing up here, then?" "He would have to find you first," Bracken pointed out from his place by his wife's side. Gilly walked on the other side of her twin, flanked by her massive mate. The dev scanned the forest, his eyes never stopping their search for any signs of danger. "He must have been tipped off to our presence in Margay," Bracken continued. "Vampires are extremely powerful, but they aren't all-knowing." "Unless you've known his kiss." Phaedra's voice was so soft, Hollie almost missed what she said. She glanced at the woman whose normally open face was suddenly shuttered. Hollie considered asking what the warrior meant, but she was afraid of the answer. "He's never kissed me," she told herself. "That means I'm okay." Taylor seemed to sense her disquiet and put an arm around her.
"You've got a lot of bodyguards. Your stalker would have to be insane to risk going up against all of us."
"He seemed sane enough when he barged into the witch's shop," Phaedra pointed out, her voice rough.
"And he was quickly dealt with,"
Cass retorted, her tone like iron, her dark eyes like black pools bubbling with testiness. There was the howl of an animal in the distance, and Hollie shivered. Rubbing her hands over her arms, she frowned. "Are we almost there? Wherever there is?" She was on edge, and the longer they spent among the spooky trees, the worse it got. She began to imagine coming around a corner to find a sprawling, decaying mansion filled with ghosts. Hollie had enjoyed Halloween as much as the next kid, gorging herself on candies, but she was usually the type to dress as a Disney princess. The gory, frightening aspect of the holiday has been lost on her, her being the type who hid her eyes from the screen during the worst parts of horror movies. This place is a scary movie come to life.
"Almost there,"
Cass said with a reassuring smile. She picked up her steps, moving toward an opening in a stand of trees. Naked branches were like widened hands reaching for her, but Hollie pushed through, closing her eyes and reminding herself that anything was better than being in the vampire's clutches.
"We're here,"
the witch announced. Hollie opened her eyes and her jaw dropped in shock. A moment before, they'd been deep in the murky forest, and now they were stepping onto a brick path clean of debris and appearing almost polished. Turning back, she saw the stand of trees growing between two stone walls, belonging to well-kept buildings on either side. The path between them was difficult to see, but if she squinted her eyes, Hollie could make out where they'd been, but just barely. Swiveling back, she took in their new surroundings. It reminded her of a quaint medieval village replica she'd visited in the form of a Renaissance fair. People in costume had flocked between imitation shops that sold everything from corsets and flowery crowns to mugs of ale and turkey legs. Hollie saw a few passers-by, their clothing more modern than what would be acceptable at the Renaissance fair, but that anachronism did nothing to impact the charming picture the village presented. Some of the anxiety she'd felt in the woods started to fade. Cass led them to the end of the block and turned a corner, entering a busy thoroughfare. Structures, most 2 or 3 stories, but a few climbing higher, lined the cobblestone roadway. It was a prosaic if busy scene, until it wasn't. An elderly man, barely 2 feet tall, grunted as he clambered out of the door to a shop with windows filled with an assortment of gold jewelry on display. He struggled down the steps, dropping what Hollie was certain were curse words while he went. At the bottom, he let out a big breath that blew up the end of his unruly mustache and straightened his leather apron. The look of aggrievement on his little face beneath his cocked cap was so endearing that Hollie had to hold back a laugh when she passed. She gave him a grin instead, and he shook his head at her, his scowl deepening. "These shopkeepers should really consider their customers," he said in a lilting voice, wagging a finger in the direction of the storefront. "Little people are bound in the web, and not just leprechauns." "Leprechaun?" Hollie said to Taylor while they continued down the street. "Is that what he is?" Taylor nodded.
"And a friendly one, it seems."
"You call that friendly?" The little man had been spitting mad in Hollie's estimation.
"He spoke to you without swearing, and he didn't once try to snatch your gold."
Hollie stared at her friend wide-eyed. "You can't be serious.
I thought those stories were exaggerations."
She cocked her head.
"And wasn't it the leprechaun always getting their gold stolen because they left it at the end of rainbows?"
Phaedra let out a single ha and crossed her arms.
"Leprechaun propaganda."
When Hollie's look of confusion grew, Taylor explained.
"Whenever they first enter a realm, they put out the story about rainbows and pots of gold. It's a cover for their nefarious plots to steal as much gold as they can. People think they're the ones having their livings stolen, but really the leprechauns are robbing them blind," Phaedra finished.
The leprechaun wasn't the only off-worlder they passed. Hollie didn't know where Cass was leading them, didn't even give it a second thought. She was too busy trying to guess at the species passing by her. An animated skeleton in a loincloth and an eye patch rushed past with a sack on his back, muttering about a late delivery in a fashion that reminded her of the White Rabbit. Wonderland isn't too far off, she thought, blinking as a flock of small winged figures in sparkling and delicately made clothing. Their gossamer wings fluttered, their voices high-pitched and melodic.
"Fairies,"
she breathed in delight.
"Pixies," Phaedra corrected. "And they're worse than the leprechauns. Avoid being alone with them at any cost."
"Why?" Hollie found it hard to believe those adorable creatures could be in any way harmful.
"You don't want to know,"
Phaedra said with a decisive nod.
"Here we are,"
Cass announced, opening a wooden gate with peeling blue paint. It creaked loudly, and to Hollie it seemed about to fall off its hinges. The walk up to the lopsided doorframe was littered with weeds and wilting flowers. Cass pushed open the faded red door and motioned them inside. The smell hit her first. Hollie's nose wrinkled, and she barely stopped herself from covering her mouth with a hand. Not wanting to be impolite to her host, she stepped inside and backed up against a wall, trying to ignore the stench. Phaedra wasn't nearly as tactful. "The place smells like a fish market that someone left out in the sun on a hot day." "It's just stuffy," Cass grumbled, pushing past the Fae to start opening some windows. "Once we get a little air in here, it'll be fine." Hollie saw the witch pull her twig. "I suppose it's a wand," she corrected herself, out of the inside pocket of her robe, giving it a little flick. A moment later, the smell dissipated. By magical means, clearly. The overpowering smell gone, Hollie could take in the situation around her. I should have guessed, given the state of her shop. Clutter was everywhere. She assumed there was furniture somewhere underneath the stacks of moldering books, piles of leaves, spools of yarn, strange statues, and dried mushrooms. And those items were only the things her eyes picked up on their first pass. "Hells!" Bracken muttered under his breath. "Try to avoid touching anything. Who knows what's lying around in here?" "This is my home you're talking about," Cass hissed, giving him a look. "Point to Bracken," the dev beside him said, lifting the back of his hand to show the large, hairy spider crawling up it. "I didn't enter here with this little accessory." "I guess we know now why you rent that shop," Phaedra said. "Your clients would take one look at this place and pay you for an immediate banishment spell for themselves." Cass rolled her eyes. "Are you guys going to keep deriding me? Or would you like to make yourselves useful? I'm looking for a book. It's about yay big." She held up her hand to indicate its size. "The cover is made out of bark." "What kind of bark?" Gilly asked, nudging a pile of what looked to be snake skins, until Hollie realized there was only one skin. The size of the snake that would have shed that could swallow me and still have room for dessert. "I can see birch, larch, and maple from here." "A choke cherry," Cass said, digging into a bookshelf with shelves so crooked Hollie thought they might collapse at any second. "What's choke cherry?" she asked Taylor softly. The Fae shrugged, shaking her head in reply. "We won't be able to find anything in this mess," Phaedra grumbled. "Agreed," Lena said, her tone less grievous. She put a hand on the witch's shoulder and made a gentle suggestion. "How about you look and we tidy up a little?" Cass nodded distractedly. "Just don't throw anything away. These are all ingredients." "Of course not," Gilly said before tossing a decaying bowl out the window, bowl and all. The witch was too busy hunting to notice, and everyone took note, silently agreeing to toss out anything that was too far gone to be good for anything, even a spell. Hollie took caution, not wanting to find any creepy crawlies of her own, but managed to organize a long table full of random objects, grouping them by color and texture in a way she found pleasant. Meanwhile, the rest of the group had magic on their side, and they made great strides, especially after Cass left the room. When the living area was clean, they moved on to the kitchen, then a small dining area. "Found it!" Cass yelled from her bedroom just as they finished the bathroom, which Hollie was surprised to see was more modern than her own. The witch appeared in the doorway, a bright orange book in her hand. "There is a spell that will fix everything," she said to Hollie. "There's just one hitch. Once I cast the spell in your realm, you can never leave it." Chapter 7. Never leave Earth again. A month ago, I would have never thought about leaving Earth in my lifetime. A lot can happen in a month, she realized. Hollie looked at the people gathered around her, strangers who had become friends, friends who lived in different realms. Realms I'll never be able to visit again. She was surprised to find that she'd come to enjoy the adventures of new worlds, at least when monsters aren't breathing down my back. It would be a big sacrifice, giving up the chance to visit her friends in their homes and maybe discover another realm or two. Then again, each realm seemed to have its own perils. She'd been tricked on Earth by an Offworlder, taken to a hell realm and enslaved, only to have to escape a succession of nasties, each bigger and nastier than the one before. If Phaedra hadn't protected her, if Gilly and Solomon hadn't fought off the dangers, she wouldn't be debating going home at all. I'd be toast. Her homesickness rushed back, and the idea of eternal safety started to sound pretty good. I understand, she said at last, her expression solemn. It's not ideal, but neither is having a vampire treat me like a snack. It's okay, Lena said, stepping close to rub her arm. We can still come visit you, can't we? Cass cocked her head to the side and thought, I don't see why not. It should allow the individuals you want to enter and keep the undesirable elements out. Phaedra gripped her shoulder, pulling her in to lock eyes with her. Although the woman intimidated her at times, what they'd experienced together on Ahrimanabad had bonded them as only shared suffering could. The seriousness of her expression let Hollie know she was speaking from the heart. This feels like giving up. Like letting the leech win. Hollie bit her lip. Disappointing people wasn't something she enjoyed. She was quick to mask her own feelings for the benefit of others, and putting herself first wasn't something that came naturally. To have her friend voice something that she'd tried to ignore when her own mind wrestled with it wasn't easy to hear. I don't belong out here in the web, she answered softly, hoping Phaedra would understand. The warrior Fae held her gaze for another moment, then let out a long breath. Without another word, she released her grip on Hollie and turned away. Cold seemed to engulf her, but Hollie told herself that Phaedra would come to understand, that she would get over her disappointment and come visit Earth when she got a chance. What's next? Bracken asked. The Fae soldier had cleaned like a maniac, straightening in a military fashion. In spite of his efforts, he still looked eager to be out of Cass's house, his eyes ranging the room as if he expected another spider to drop at any moment. I need to gather some ingredients, Cass said, stepping into the living space and looking around. Hands on her hips, she turned to face them. I told you not to throw anything away. We didn't, Lena told her gently, a hand on her shoulder. Not much. Anyway, and nothing of consequence. How would you know what's of consequence? Cass asked her, voice rising in pitch. I told you everything in here was an ingredient. And some of yours were in bad shape, Gilly said, coming around to her other side and sliding a small pouch into it. I'm sure that's more than enough to compensate you for any ingredients you might have lost. I'm sure there's somewhere in some thrace where you can pick up the ingredients we need, the dev followed up, his arm around his wife. Cass's eyes narrowed, but she hefted the pouch in her hand, opening it and looking inside. A smile spread across her face. Let's go shopping! The shop was much more orderly than the storefront where they'd met Cass. In fact, it reminded her of an organic grocery store she'd visited once in Madison. Plenty of fresh herbs and fungi, dried flowers hanging from the rafters, and the scent of essential oils mixed with fresh-baked bread. Hollie took a long inhale, the ghost of a grin on her face. I can never tell when these things are ripe, a melodious voice said nearby. Hollie opened her eyes to find a handsome stranger holding a piece of fruit in her direction. Am I supposed to shake it, or tap it, or sniff it? His confused expression was disarming, and Hollie took the fruit from him, holding it in both hands. Pretending to study the fruit, she instead studied him from under her lashes. Hazel eyes stared out of tanned skin, topped by light blonde hair and an attractive mop. His grin was mischievous, adding to his overall charm. I'm sorry, she said after a moment, holding the fruit back out to him. I'm afraid I have no idea what that is. He chuckled and took the fruit back from her. It's called night cloud, because when you crack it open, he said, shaking it fiercely before bashing it against the corner of a wooden crate holding identical fruit, then peeling the halves apart,
releasing a little black cloud that sent up sudden small flashes of light. "You released the night." "It does look like night," Hollie marveled, the flashes of light like stars in a dark sky. The cloud of night didn't last long, however, and soon enough it dissipated. "I guess this one wasn't fully ripe," Jude said with a shrug. "It should have lasted longer." "It was lovely," she said with a conciliatory grin. "It was passable," he countered. "You, on the other hand, are definitely lovely." Hollie could feel herself blushing. "I'm flattered." "Jude," he said with slight inclination of his head. "And who do I have the pleasure of meeting?" "Hollie," she said, holding out her hand, forced by habit. He took it, but instead of shaking her hand, he planted a gentle kiss on the back of it. "Enchanted. And what an appropriate name for a witch, after a plant that is both beautiful and poisonous." "Oh, I'm not a witch," Hollie corrected. "But as to my poison content, the jury is out." Jude laughed, and she realized he hadn't yet released her hand. His skin was warm and his grip not unpleasant. Still, she gently pulled away, blushing again. "Thank you for showing me the night cloud, and good luck finding a proper ripe one." "Going so soon?" he asked, following her down the aisle and toward Taylor and Phaedra, who were debating over the proper pattern of speckles on the bird eyes Cass was inspecting. "You're a lady on a mission, eh?" You could say that again, she thought to herself. A mission of locking myself away in a prison of my own making. "We're sort of in the middle of something," she explained. "In the middle means not yet at the end, like our conversation." He caught her hand. "What is a non-witch doing in Samothrace? The mystery is too good to let go." Hollie giggled and felt embarrassed that the sound came out of her. "He's flirting with me, and I like it." "I'm here with friends. We're buying ingredients." "What's the spell?" he asked, leaning against a rack containing a plethora of cacti, some of which seemed to be moving. "Let me guess. A hex on your boyfriend for forgetting your birthday." She laughed and shook her head. "I'm single, but I'm thinking that was more of a question than a real guess." "Gorgeous and smart," he murmured, shaking his head. The look he was giving her made Hollie's temperature rise. "And single. Let me guess again. You're from Earth." Hollie's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "That's the only realm in the web where the men are that stupid." Jude winked at her, and Hollie giggled again. "Before long, I'll be snorting like a middle school girl." "I am from Earth," she said, tugging away again, "and I've got to be getting back there." As she said the words, regret filled her. It figures I would meet someone cute and interested in me right before returning to Earth. Talk about over before it began. "What's the rush? Your realm will still be there in a few hours. Have dinner with me." His charm was having an effect on her. Hollie was a moment from giving in. She opened her mouth to accept his invitation, figuring her friends couldn't fault her for one last flirtation. But before she could speak, Bracken approached, his demeanor stiff. "Is this guy bothering you, Hollie?" "Not at all," she was quick to say, putting herself between the Fae male and Jude. "We were just talking." Bracken eyed the man, folding his arms across his broad chest. He spoke to Hollie, but never took his gaze off Jude. "Cass is just finishing up. We're about to head back to hers, though I hope for the shortest time possible." "I have to go," Hollie said, turning to Jude. "It was nice meeting you." "Nice is not the word I'd use for it," he replied, dropping another wink. "Don't be a stranger to Samothrace. I owe you a meal." As they walked away, Bracken looked at her. "What was that about?" It wasn't Hollie who answered. It was Solomon, who appeared suddenly by her side. "Just a warlock pulling some slick moves," he said. "Lena and I were listening on the other side of the aisle. Textbook seduction." Hollie tried to hide her frown. "I guess I'm a slow learner because nothing about that seemed like a textbook to me." "He seemed nice." "Nice isn't the word I'd use for it," Solomon quoted in a husky voice. "Believe me, nothing about that guy is nice. Warlocks are generally the scum of the multiverse, and they should be avoided by pretty females like you." "Thanks, Dad," Hollie said under her breath, relieved to find Gilly and Lena in the next aisle, giggling over the shapes of the mushrooms filling the shelves. "What do you think, Hollie?" Gilly said when she approached. Pointing out a fat stubby one, she asked, "Which do you prefer, that one or—" Her finger moved to point at a taller, thinner one with a slight curve. That one. I don't care for mushrooms, Hollie said, looking away so as not to blush for the third time that afternoon. The truth is, I have no idea which one I prefer. Having a boyfriend isn't exactly easy when you still live at home with a protective father. Did live at home, she corrected herself, then sighed. And home is what I'm in a rush to get back to. Oh, the irony. Gilly burst out laughing, and Lena covered her mouth with a hand. You see, my opinion is... Her words were cut off when Solomon playfully covered her mouth. I think this is a conversation for another time. Cass is bagging up her purchases. Time to go. Hollie followed along as they retraced their steps back to the witch's abode, thoughts of Jude still lingering in her head. This doesn't have to be your last flirtation, she told herself. Just because you're stuck on Earth doesn't mean you're stuck in Watoma. It's time to make that move to Chicago. Get that cute apartment, meet a guy, fall in love, buy a house, have a family of your own. Her spirits started to rise, only to dampen a little when she saw the moon sail out from behind a cloud, a harbinger of the coming night. The vampire. His image floated, unbidden, into her mind, and she frowned. Pushing the image away, she told herself that she was done letting the creature interfere in her life. Soon I'll be rid of my nocturnal stalker, Hollie told herself, and my life will finally begin. Time to go home, to get the life I always wanted. Hope buoying her, Hollie looked forward to a future without limits, or leeches. Chapter 8.
This is it, folks,
Cass announced once they'd returned to her living area.
We're heading to Earth, so anyone who wants to head elsewhere, speak now or find yourself deep in human territory, for good or ill.
A bag of ingredients hung over her shoulder, and the orange book was tucked under her arm. Time for goodbyes. Hollie realized and immediately got choked up. Although she hadn't known the twins or their mates long, she'd grown to care deeply for them. I'm going to miss you, she blurted out in a cracking voice, then moved to hug Gilly tightly. Both of you, she corrected, pulling Lena into the hug. I wish there was some other way of doing this, but I have to take the chance I've got. We know, Lena replied softly. We'll miss you too, Gilly said, her tone gruff. Gilly was the more stoic of the sisters, but Hollie saw her blinking away tears. We'll visit, Bracken assured her, moving to embrace her once she loosened her hold on the twins. Don't worry, Solomon added when it was his turn for a hug. There's no way those two will let us get away with not visiting often. Hollie gave him a watery smile. Thank you, she whispered, her voice getting stronger, and she repeated herself. Thanks to all of you. I never would have made it through without you. She put her hands over her heart. I'll never forget any of you. It's back to the Fae realm for us, Lena told Cass. The witch nodded, then stepped over to what appeared to be an ordinary closet door. Lifting her fist, she rapped on it, an intricate pattern that was over so quickly Hollie didn't have a chance to sort the taps out. Cass gripped the knob and swung the door open. On the other side lay the towering trees and forest paths of the Fae realm.
You have a portal in your house,
Taylor said, clearly impressed. Cass shrugged like it was no big deal.
Perk of being a witch.
The quarters stepped up to the threshold. Goodbye, Lena and Gilly said in unison, leaving their arms in the same motion. Identical twins down to their muscle memory. The only thing that's different are the eyes and the girls' personalities. Gilly and Lena had gone through a hellish childhood, having been created as weapons in a misplaced war started by the manipulations of an off-world pair who hoped to harvest the tremendous energy of the Fae realm for their own. For years, they'd not known each other existed, victims of a memory block that could only be removed by magical means. They'd managed to defeat the off-world evil, save the realm, and reunite their family. But it hadn't been easy. But their mates had helped them through, and in that moment, Hollie felt the ache of not having someone. Someone who would help her, protect her, cherish her like Solomon and Bracken cherished their wives. Someday, she told herself, waving until the four of them faded into the Fae Wilds. Cass shut the door and turned to face the remaining women, an inquisitive look on her face.
Well, Wing Fae, what's the verdict? On to Valantia?
Not a chance for me,
Taylor said, linking her arm with Hollie's.
If you'll have me, I'd love to get an immersive experience in the field. Really see what an average life is like in the Earth realm.
Hollie laughed. Average? Vampire stalkers are not average.
After the witch's work, you'll be average again,
Taylor reminded. For some reason, the words didn't make Hollie feel any better. I'm going to Earth too, Phaedra said, but Hollie could tell she wasn't pleased about the prospect. Until I'm certain your spells work, witch, I'm sticking by this one's side in case the vampire comes for her again.
Very well,
Cass said, her back stiff after Phaedra's doubtful words. She rapped again at the door, a completely different but equally quick rhythm. Opening the door, the witch revealed a dim room, the setting sun illuminating a canoe and a couple kayaks leaning against a concrete wall, flanked by old boxes and a tool chest that was almost too rusty to function. It's my garage, Hollie realized, surprised. How did you know where I live? Trade secrets, Cass said, then took a step through. Turning back, she beckoned the others.
It takes a lot of power to keep this thing open. Let's get a move on, ladies.
Once all four of them were on the other side, Cass closed the door, leaving them in near darkness. Come on, she said, heading toward the door that led into the mudroom inside Hollie's small house. The vampire's probably watching this house, which is why I put us inside and not out on the lawn. Inside the house, Hollie looked around, feeling a bit surreal. Everything was where she'd left it weeks ago. She flicked a light switch, illuminating a narrow hallway that led to the kitchen. At least the lights are still on. Thank goodness for autopay. Gathered in the kitchen, Phaedra turned to Cass. What's next? Turning to Hollie, the witch said, I need a large table to work on. Will that work? It's the largest I have. The kitchen table had been big enough for the three of them when her mother was still alive, and more than enough room when it was just her and her father. It will do in a pinch, Cass said, then patted the table. Up you go. Up? Hollie responded, confused. Yes, up. You're the thing I'm going to be working on. The first ingredient, so to speak. She patted the table again, and this time Hollie climbed onto it, already feeling foolish. Lie down, Cass instructed, and she did as the witch bid. What's going to happen? She asked, staring up at the ceiling and realizing it could use a coat of paint. You're not going to do anything drastic, are you? Or painful? Not painful, no. Drastic depends on your definition. The witch smiled down at her, patting her shoulder reassuringly. You'll be fine. Although before we begin, I will need a quick signature on this form. Cass held up a piece of parchment onto which was scrawled lines of tiny cursive text. What is this? Hollie asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. Just a standard waiver. I'll not be held liable for mishaps resulting from any spells, hexes, and rituals that are out of my control due to acts of nature, gods or goddesses, or malevolent forces that were not previously disclosed. You know, boilerplate. I don't know, Hollie grumbled, but she knew she didn't have much choice in the matter. Can you hand me a pen? You don't need a pen, just use your finger, like you humans do on your technological devices. Hollie lifted her finger and traced out her signature. It was just as sloppy as the one she signed along with her morning coffee at the shop near her office. Cass rolled it up with a snap and set it aside, then rubbed her hands together. You ready? As I'll ever be, Hollie said, anxiety starting to rise within her. Close your eyes, Cass said softly. It's best if you're asleep for this next part. Sometimes humans can experience side effects with magic blessed by Hecate. Side effects? Hollie started to sit up, but the witch shushed her, gently pushing her back onto the table. It's not what you're thinking, Cass told her. It's a little like seasickness, a tummy ache, maybe some dizziness. In extreme cases, a headache. But it's best to avoid all that if we can by putting you to sleep. Fine, Hollie said, closing her eyes. In for a penny, in for as much gold as was in the pouch Gilly laid on the witch. Concentrating on her breathing, she wondered how she'd ever fall asleep in this position. She could scarcely finish the thought before sleep found her. Hollie found herself walking through a grey, formless void. Somehow she knew she was sleeping, that she'd been put here to wait out the ritual. She could hear Cass's voice rattling off foreign words that had no meaning to her. The witch's words sounded far away, like they were broadcasting from a loudspeaker several streets away. Except there are no streets in this place. She looked around, seeing only an indistinct haze that stretched to infinity on all sides of her. At least she could have left me a chair. Restless, Hollie walked around a bit, her steps taking her nowhere. While she waited, time stretched out and her mind wandered. Where it ended up wasn't where she expected. I wonder what he's doing right now, the vampire who thinks he's my mate. Is he parked outside my house, waiting for me to return so he can pounce, or has he already forgotten about me? Although she'd wished fervently many times over for the vampire to forget her, there was a tiny part of her that worried that she was making a mistake. You're a fool, she told herself. How could cutting yourself off from the vamp permanently be a mistake? The image of his handsome face flashed before her eyes. Okay, sure, he's hot, but talk about toxic. Shaking her head, Hollie told herself to concentrate on the future, on the changes she was about to make. I'll put the house on the market. Tim Grady is always boasting about how he can sell anything. Maybe he can get a decent price for my sliver of real estate. Despite her attempt to distract herself, she started to lose concentration as Cass continued to drone on. It reminded her of the buzzing of bees around a hive. Her thoughts flicked back to the vampire without warning, and she wondered what would have happened if they'd been alone in the shop. He stroked my cheek so gently. What if I have the wrong idea about him? Her inner voice wasn't about to give in to doubt. He's a vampire. How could I have the wrong idea about him? He drinks blood, for goodness sake. She leaned over, putting her forehead in her hands and letting out a groan. When will this be over already? I want my life back. Hollie whirled around, even though every direction was the same in this place, and started walking again to relieve some of her frustration. The void was starting to get to her. Literally nothing in any direction was a little like sensory deprivation. Her brain cried out for stimulation. She groaned again, looking up at the ceiling before returning her gaze to the horizon, or lack thereof. In the distance, something stood. What something? Hollie started to jog toward the only part of the space that wasn't nothing. It took a while to reach the something, but before long she could make out what it was. A door. She continued toward it, wondering how a door had appeared out of nothing. Maybe it's like the door in Cass's house. It's some sort of portal to another world. When Hollie reached the door, she circled slowly around it. There was nothing on either side but void. She rubbed her forehead, wondering what to do next. If it is a door like the one in the witch's house, then maybe I'm supposed to go through it? Maybe that's the point of the ritual. The notion began to gain strength. It makes sense, I suppose. Walking through the door to a realm within a realm, a dream within a dream, a slice of the multiverse where I'm protected from evil forces. She was tired of not knowing, so she decided to take action. Stepping forward, Hollie took the handle in her hand. It was cool to the touch. She turned the knob, and the door opened. "Bupkis," she said when she saw that only more formless void was on the other side. Now, what is the point of this? Still, now that the door was open, she figured she might as well cross through it, if only to take away some of the boredom she felt here. Well, here goes nothing. With a deep breath, she walked through the door. Chapter 9. How long have I been here? Hollie looked up from her desk at the big clock that hung on the opposing wall. It was the same clock she'd been looking at since she was a girl while waiting for her father to finish up their work so they could head home to Mom. She rubbed her eyes, unable to make out the numbers. I must be tired, she mumbled, glancing down at the papers on her desk and realizing she couldn't make out the words on them either. That's weird. Hollie stood, stretching and taking in her surroundings. It was definitely the insurance agency. It looked the same as it always did, save that there were no clients in the office at the moment. But what was I doing just before this? I feel like The feeling started to fade even as she considered it. She looked out the window at the same street that had always been there. Hollie started at the sound of whistling coming from behind her. She whirled around to see her father heading toward her with a steaming mug. "Daddy!" She rushed to meet him, taking the mug out of his hand and setting it down on his desk. Hollie threw her arms around her father. "I missed you." Frank Townsend chuckled indulgently. "I was only in the break room long enough to warm up a mug of tea for you, but I missed you too, sweetheart." Hollie let go, smiling at him. Of course, he was only in the kitchen for a moment. She picked up her mug and headed back to her desk, a sense of security settling over her, a feeling of normality that she hadn't felt in a while. Settling back into her chair, she swiveled it around to face her father's desk. He raised his chin and sent her a smile. "You about ready to pull out your tent this weekend? I heard the bass are biting up at the lake." Hollie rolled her eyes. "When are you going to buy a cabin on that lake already? You're too old to sleep on the ground anymore, Dad." "Are you calling me an old man?" he sniffed, pretending to be offended. "I've still got plenty of years of good life left in me." A pang hit her square in the chest, and Hollie's brow furrowed. She rubbed absently at her chest, willing the pain away. "How about I spring for a night in the lodge? Then no one has to bother with the tent, especially since it always seems to rain when we camp out." "Oh, sweetheart, you're breaking my heart." An aggravated expression took up residence on his features. "I thought I raised you better than that, wasting perfectly good money on a hotel when you can sleep in the tent for the cost of a few cups of coffee." "Don't forget the cost of losing a night of good sleep," she countered. "Hush, child," he said, pulling on his glasses from where he'd set them on his desk. "Your old man has work to do." "Old man indeed," she said under her breath. "I heard that," he said, staring at her from over his glasses. Hollie giggled, delighted to be having a humorous exchange with her father. The pang hit her again, and she frowned, wondering what was causing it. The bell over the door tinkled. Hollie looked up, her eyes meeting the gaze of the tall, attractive man entering the agency. "Hello," she called cheerfully, rising to greet him. "Welcome to Townsend Insurance. I'm Hollie. How can we help you today?" The stranger didn't respond right away. Instead, he strolled toward her desk, pulling out one of the chairs stationed on the other side of it and seating himself. "I'm Maz," he said once he'd settled in. Hollie retook her own seat, folding her hands in front of her. "What are you looking for?" "Something that lasts forever," he said at last, his voice a tad husky. Hollie could feel heat spreading through her insides. That the man was handsome was undeniable, but looking closer at him, she thought he was actually bypassing handsome and into beautiful territory. His long brown hair was accented with strands of gold. It was pulled into a leather thong at the nape of his neck. Eyes the same blue as the ice on Lake Winnebago in January, above a strong nose and angular cheekbones. His lips, however, looked pillow-soft. His skin was a little pale, but unblemished. And don't get me started on that ridiculous body. He looks like he could bench press my desk and not break a sweat. "I think we have something that might work for you," she said finally, realizing she had to talk or he'd catch her checking him out. "Most of our policies are lifetime policies, if that's what you mean." "Something like that." He leaned back to cross one leg over the other knee, then picked an invisible piece of lint off his dark slacks. Looking up, Hollie was caught again in his hypnotic gaze. "Although I wonder how long you consider a lifetime to be." "I'm not an actuary," she said with a chuckle. "I don't underwrite the policies. I just sell them." "Don't sell yourself short," he chastised, leaning forward to rest his hands on the desk. They were well formed, the nails impeccably trimmed. Hollie took a deep breath, telling herself to get a grip. "You're acting like you've never seen an attractive man before." "I do live in Watama," she answered, her inner voice tartly. "And this guy is definitely not from Watama." "Are you new in town?" she asked, changing tack suddenly. "I am," he nodded, "although I'm not sure how long I'll be staying." His eyes lingered on her. "I might be persuaded to stick around, however, should an interesting opportunity arise." I have no idea what he's talking about, but I love the way he sounds. His accent was faint, and not one she could place, but his slight brogue had her skin tingling. I don't think I've ever been attracted to someone so instantly before. Taking a sip of tea to calm herself, Hollie set the mug down and straightened her shoulders. We offer a range of life insurance policies, as well as auto and home insurance as well. What are you looking for in particular? Once again, he evaded her question and asked one of his own. Are you happy here, Hollie? How do I answer that? She licked her lips nervously, then caught him watching her mouth, which only ratcheted up the heat level rising inside her. Thoughts tumbled through her mind, thoughts of her life, the home she shared with her father, her dreams deferred. While she thought her eyes were on his face, tracing his perfect features, the combination short-circuited her brain. Yes, she said at last, as much to fill the silence as anything else. A dark eyebrow rose, and the corner of his mouth twitched up. I sense some hesitation in your response. Hollie looked down at her hands, noticing that her knuckles were turning white from how tightly she was clasping them. I don't know what's going on, but something is off about this whole exchange. You know, you seem like a man who values experience. I'm going to suggest you speak to my father, who is well versed in all the policies we offer. She swiveled around, expecting to see her father working away at his desk. He wasn't, and his desk, which a moment ago filled with papers and photo frames, was empty. Dad? She said, suddenly feeling unmoored. Where did he go? Hollie turned back and gave the stranger a nervous smile. I'm sorry, he was just at his desk. At the window behind Maz, she saw a cloud blot out the sun. A light rain started to patter against the glass, and the office darkened around her. Ignoring the slightly sinister turn, she stood again. Excuse me for a moment. I'll just go find him. Passing his desk, she looked at it again, confirming that it was clear of anything belonging to her father. Running a finger down its surface, she came away with a circle of dust on her fingertip. Hollie frowned, her feeling of foreboding intensifying. A short hallway divided the front of the office from the area in back. On the left of the hallway was their filing and supply room. It was dark inside, the copier sitting silently. In fact, it didn't even seem to be turned on. She turned her attention to the small kitchen area, expecting to find her father there, making himself a cup of afternoon coffee, despite her warnings that it would keep him up half the night. The kitchen, however, was empty. No one sat at the small round table. The coffee pot was empty. The only sound was the very slow drip from the faucet in the small sink. Dad? She called anyway, wondering where her father could have gotten to. There was a fire exit at the end of the short hall, but it remained locked. I suppose he could have gone out to the alley and locked the fire door on his way out, but why would he? He always goes out the front and rarely leaves in the afternoon. Besides, it's raining. Hollie took a step back into the break room and pried open the blinds, looking out into the shadowy alley. It was dim out there and devoid of anyone. She straightened, then let out a gasp when someone called her name. Turning around, she froze when she realized the stranger had followed her into the break room. Looking for an escape? Maz asked, a sharp smile on his face. Swallowing hard, Hollie let out a nervous laugh. Not exactly. She took a step away from the window. This is a staff area, and clients aren't really supposed to come back here. Maz stared at her, not moving away. He took 2 steps into the room, his presence dominating the small space. What are you afraid of? He asked after a moment, his voice low and urgent. Although Hollie had been a victim of her attraction to the stranger while in the front office, his husky tone was now off-putting. Their fun flirtation had shifted into something darker, something that made her anxiety climb. Attempting to break the tension, Hollie started to move past him. Let's go back to my desk, she said, hoping he didn't hear the quiver in her voice. He reached out to grip her arm, his hand like a vice. You didn't answer my question. The rough tone of his words had her heart beating harder. Let go of me, she whispered. But her muscles were locked in place, and she didn't struggle against him. Answer the question. What are you afraid of? His eyes were colder than the wind chill coming off Lake Michigan in the dead of winter. You, she said at last, unable to keep it in. I'm afraid of you. Good, he said, then smiled widely, exposing 2 sharp canine teeth. Fangs. Suddenly, reality crashed into her brain, clearing some of the fog that was lingering there. This is a dream. Another nightmare. The vampire has found me? Hollie let out a high-pitched scream. The sight of fangs released her from her petrified state, and she yanked her arm out of his grip. She bolted, a wave of panic hitting her, followed by the weight of her memory. "Dad!" her mind cried, and she let out a whimper. Seeing her father again, even in the dream, was intense. Part of her was grateful to be with him again, even if none of it was real. Not real. I'm literally running away from an in-the-flesh vampire. Who says this isn't real? She burst back into the front office and risked a glance over her shoulder. The vampire was walking steadily toward her, an expression of glee on his face. He's enjoying this. What a jerk. She was a few feet from the front door when the vampire appeared in front of her. Hollie didn't have time to slow down her flight and collided with him. Maz wrapped his arm around her, his grip strong and sure. "You belong to me. There's nothing you can do, nowhere you can hide. You are mine." His fangs flashed and Hollie flinched, waiting for the moment when they pierced her flesh and changed things forever. Chapter 10. Maz scowled down at the Warden of Hell. The tiger shifted cowering beneath him. The shifter's moods affected their form, and given Tubo's current panic, his body rippled almost constantly, patches of orange and black fur appearing and disappearing in a fashion that reminded the vampire of a kaleidoscope.
"I don't know where the blasted imp is,"
Tubo insisted from his position on his back on the cold stone floor, his belly exposed to Maz, as if he were a more formidable tiger.
"For all I know, Dallin is still rotting in his cell in the Hall of Punishment."
"So much for your vaunted network of information," Maz spat. Tubo was at the center of a web of lesser hellspawn who gathered information and performed petty malfeasances on his command. "Although, I suppose an intelligence agency requires the very thing you don't have. Intelligence." Anger lit the shifter's eyes, but his fear kept him from retaliating. Maz let out a huff of disgust. "Get on your feet. I'm not going to disembowel you. At least not this minute." Tubo clambered to his feet, attempting to return his disheveled clothing back into place. Not for the first time, Maz thanked the dark beings for not being born a shifter. The wardrobe budget must be astronomical, considering they end up ripping through their clothing with any unintentional shift. The warden's head was bowed, his eyes on a spot right before his feet, just past the toes that were now sticking through his claw-ravaged boots. "I want the imp found," Maz said, his voice tinged with a tone that said he would accept no failures. Vampires had many powers, all of which were useful, but perhaps none more so than the ability to compel others with their words. He used the only slightest hint of compulsion now, but it was still unmistakable.
"My team are already blanketing the web, hunting for the human. Do you want us to shift operations? Prioritize Dallin over the woman?"
Maz hesitated. Hollie was still his top priority, but if he failed to deliver the imp, Samael would want to know what was keeping him from his mission. And if the Angel of Death discovered the existence of his eternal mate, then he'd never have a chance to claim her. "I want the imp found," the vampire reiterated, flashing his fangs. He couldn't bring himself to say the words out loud, to tell Tubo to leave off pursuit of his most precious prize, but he knew the shifter would interpret his words correctly. Rather than use the door this time, Maz traveled elsewhere in the blink of an eye. Many creatures who had the ability to move through space at a thought called it that. Traveling could be considered to be more useful even than compulsion. In an instant, he could go anywhere in the multiverse he wanted, as long as he knew of its existence. And the place he chose to go in that moment was the only one in the entire web that was his and his alone. The pocket dimension labeled SX37 wasn't large, its entirety consisting of about 10,000 square meters or so of space, but it was his, and in moments of agitation and strife, it had become his refuge. He'd appeared in his bedroom, an airy space full of windows that looked out of the endless night of his mini-realm. It had cost a fortune to renovate the crumbling estate he'd found here when taking possession of the realm after winning it in a game of chance.
The sniveling boggart who'd overcommitted on his dice roll had disappeared after his loss, forcing Maz to track him down and take the magical key from him by violence. Frightened that Samael or his minions might discover the pocket realm, he'd hired a warlock to melt down the key and meld it with his skin, in essence making him the key. He'd then paid a bulging pouch of platinum to the magic user to hex his estate so heavily that no one would ever be able to find it, or even know of its existence without extreme effort. To leave no loose ends, he disposed of the warlock and reclaimed his platinum pouch as soon as the hexes were finished. The moment he sat on his mattress, exhaustion weighed him down. Maz couldn't remember the last time he'd slept. Sinking into his bed, its plushness in stark contrast to his dwelling on Pluto, where he'd possessed no cushions and nothing but stone for pillow, he found himself on the edge of sleep. A vampire as old as he could forego sleep for days, weeks, even months when pushed. Maz preferred not to go without it for long periods because it began to affect his abilities, and staying sharp was the difference between life and death. Tiredness dulled his edge. But this thing with his mate, it compounded everything, including lack of sleep affecting him. Maybe it was the emotional turmoil or the anxiety that twisted his insides every moment that he wasn't by his mate's side. Whatever the cause, his fatigue was heavier than he'd felt in centuries. He closed his eyes, and the image of the red-haired beauty appeared, like it did every time he closed them. Or opened them. I can't help it. I'm entranced. The need to be near her bit at him, keeping him awake despite the exhaustion. What can I do? She's gone again. An idea formed suddenly. Rest is what my body craves, but my mind drives me to keep searching for her. Why not give them both what they want? He might not be able to be with her physically, but there was another way. It required timing, which was always difficult to gauge. But if he slept at the same time that Hollie did, he could potentially locate her dream and enter it. The problem is, I have no idea when she might sleep. I'd practically have to spend all of my time sleeping. A long yawn hit him. Hells, it looks like I'm up for a nice long rest. His mind made up, Maz let himself fall into sleep, ready to spend as long as it took to find his mate in the world of dreams. He floated in darkness, his consciousness adjusting to unconsciousness. One by one, small twinkling lights appeared around him, each one representing a dream. Some had a light pink tinge, others light blue or green. Some pulsed quickly, others slower. Each was unique from the next, and as Maz paused, he could get the faintest sense of the dream's owner. There were orc dreams, elf dreams, and even the dream of a dragon that pulsed red so slowly it barely seemed to flicker at all. The dream of a mermaid passed on his left, and he caught a faint whiff of salt in the air. A young princess from a feudal realm and her courtier fantasies floated by, her dream presenting as a fuzzy pink orb. There were kings and commoners, magic users and physical champions, the living and the dead. And there was one green-eyed human female with a scent that left him in an agony of need. I found her! He was on her like a magnet, traveling to her dream, which was blinking yellow in a pattern that resembled a rapidly beating heart. Without hesitating, he peered into her dream, keeping himself hidden. I won't make the same mistake this time, rampaging toward her. I want to see what she's dreaming about. Maz was surprised to find it was him. His likeness pursued her down a muddy forest path, the night cold enough to reach out and bite. Fatigue lined her features, and her eyes had a wild look. His chest ached. I hate seeing her so scared, especially knowing that I am the cause. Obviously, my pursuit of her has affected her strongly, to my eternal regret. If she would only let me explain myself. Except he wasn't capable of an explanation. Every time he got close to her, the need he felt for her as his mate drove him into a frenzy that led to his many bad decisions. How can I control myself enough to keep her from reacting with panic? And how can I gain her trust when she thinks I plan to devour her? Maz wasn't certain that he could. He knew what he looked like to her now. The expression of terror on her face said it all. I've got to convince her to see me as something other than a bloodthirsty leech. The vampire that looked like him glided forward, seeming to delight in flashing fangs that were obscenely long, a caricature of his own. Hollie let out a yelp, putting on a burst of speed. She stumbled, and it took everything inside him not to rush to her, to catch her and cradle her in his arms, to destroy the other him, ripping him apart so that he could never menace her again. But he's me, and all that would do is confuse her. I've got to show restraint, the most restraint I've ever exercised in my long life. Fortitude had always been one of his strong points. Her beauty has just erased it from his mind. I will not fail in this. It was time to use his abilities in the dream realm to his advantage. Time to change her perspective on me. Maz knew that he might not get another chance to woo her, to end the pattern they'd established of her fleeing every chance she got. Time to prove to my mate that I can't be the vampire, the man of her dreams. Chapter 11. Hollie was tired of running. Even in a dream, her feet ached. Won't this guy ever get tired of chasing me? As if he could read her thoughts. Maybe he can, she thought in alarm. The vampire called to her. I am relentless, he howled, his expression one of malicious glee. You should give up now, for you will never escape me. I've had enough of this. Letting out a noise of exasperation, Hollie came to a stop. She whirled around and unleashed her anger on her pursuer. I'm getting damn tired of this. The moment she shouted, the vampire froze. Looking at the night sky above him, his brow furrowed. Without warning, her pursuer disappeared. What the? Hollie rubbed her arms, looking around her. The forest trail ran along the river a few blocks away from downtown Watoma. She'd run since managing to break the vamp's grip on her at her office. He'd followed her, steadily and without stopping, all the way here. So where had he gone now? It has to be a trick. Hollie took a few deep breaths, her anger and fear swelling together, a sick sensation appearing in her stomach as a result. Starting to retrace her steps, she tried to ignore the fear creeping up her spine. When the vampire had been right behind her, at least she knew where he was. Not knowing was ramping up her fright once again. The more frightened she got, the angrier she became. The tension came to a head when the path passed through a close copse of trees. Forcing herself into the shadows, she sent up an angry shout to the leech she knew was following her. I'm not afraid of you! She froze at the sound of footsteps. Out of the shadows, the vampire materialized. Hollie stood her ground, not willing to run this time. He came to a stop just in front of her, shocking her with his one-word response. Good! Her jaw dropped at his repetition, remembering what he'd said to her after she'd admitted she was afraid of him in the break room. Why are you doing this to me? She cried, her voice squeaking, her emotions taking over. What do you want from me? Another chance. The vampire lifted his arms, holding up his open palms to her. We got off on the wrong foot. I'd like a chance to explain things to you. Maybe I can take you for a drink. A drink, she snapped. You've got to be kidding me. His mouth quirked into a smile. Suddenly, the world blurred around her. Hollie found herself sitting at a polished bar in an intimate establishment decorated with greenery. Vines hung above the bar, and plants took up every corner, seeming to climb the walls and wrap around the booths. A piano tinkled in the distance, and the flickering candles gave the polished wood walls a glow. The vampire sat beside her, indicating the glass of golden liquid in front of her. There's no way I'm touching that. Hollie stared straight ahead, not sure how to react to her current predicament. The vampire didn't push her. He lifted his own glass to his lips, draining it swiftly, then raising his finger. A beautiful woman with creamy skin and hair like spun gold, with tiny flowing vines that seemed to grow along with her curls, appeared. Another glass of claret, he said, holding out his empty one. The servant nodded and left to refill his glass. Claret? Not blood? Hollie let out a breath of relief. She lifted a shaky hand to her head, riding the wave of adrenaline that had flooded her during her flight and lingered in her system. Maybe I should have a drink, she thought. When the server appeared, she put in an order.
Could I have a bourbon and ginger ale?
The woman cocked her head, sending tiny white flower petals all over the bar.
Ginger ale? I'm afraid I'm not familiar.
Dryads are famed for their sweet syrups, the vampire told Hollie. I suggest you order your liquor with their specialty liquid. Her desire to trust the vampire was about even with her desire to spend a day at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Better yet, I'd rather go back to middle school than believe one thing that guy says. Hollie turned to the woman.
Dryad? Is that what you are?
The server nodded with a bright smile.
I'm a tree nymph, and he speaks the truth. We are famed for our syrup cocktails.
She blinked cheerfully, and some of Hollie's anxiety eased.
Okay, she relented. Bring me one, please.
The nymph nodded and took away her glass, returning soon with a substitute. Setting it on the bar, she inclined her head in a bow.
Enjoy!
Hollie took a sip, then a gulp as the ethereal sweetness of the beverage hit her tongue.
This is glorious,
she sighed. Enraptured once she finally came up for air. The vampire grinned, and she realized he was being careful not to expose his fangs. That understanding brought her frustration crashing back.
Why are you doing this? Is this your next trick? Try to lure me to trust you again, only to terrorize me once more? I don't get it. Why don't you just drain me and be done with it?
His smile faded, but her tirade didn't stop.
I know you're stronger than me, faster than me, with powers I can't possibly imagine. Why drag this out? Does fear make my blood taste better? Is that what this is?
The vampire shook his head. His expression saddened. I'm afraid you have the wrong impression, which is entirely my fault. You see, I am drawn to you, so strongly that it is taking every ounce of my formidable control just to talk to you civilly and not.
Hollie swallowed hard and stared down at her drink. That doesn't exactly make me feel better.
I know, the vampire let out a heavy breath. I asked for a second chance and the opportunity to explain. You've been exceedingly kind in agreeing to listen to me rather than run out of here screaming.
Not like there's much point in that, is there? You'll just follow me.
She picked up her glass and knocked back the remaining liquid. Lifting her finger, she motioned to the server to bring her another. Careful, he warned. Dryad syrup tends to intensify the effects of alcohol.
Good, she said gruffly.
Pushing her hair out of her face, she stared hard at him. There's something I don't understand. Well, more than one thing, but here's what I need to know. What was the point of all of that earlier? Coming to my office and putting on the charm offensive before scaring the daylights out of me and chasing me for 1.5 miles. His grin was back. There's a simple explanation to that. That wasn't me. Her look was disbelieving, her tone filled with sass. Really? Because he looked just like you, or do you have a twin vampire? I'm not sure you've noticed, but we are in a dream. Your dream, to be exact. Hollie frowned. A dream. The vague memory of the void with Cass's voice echoing around it came to her mind. I found a door and walked through it. Her thoughts were cloudy, which lent strength to his explanation.
So this is my dream. Does that mean that you don't actually exist, that I am talking to a construct of my own subconscious?
Not exactly. I exist, but the guy who was chasing you earlier, he's the construct.
It wasn't me, she mimicked smartly. He just happened to look like me. Am I really supposed to believe that? Next, you'll be telling me that you're not a vampire at all, just a dentally challenged immortal who enjoys his steaks extra rare.
He laughed, the sound surprisingly pleasant. I never hoped for a sense of humor. The dark gods have truly blessed me.
Hollie shook her head. You said you were going to explain, but you're only confusing me more. How is he a construct, but you aren't?
Vampires have the ability to walk the world of dreams, to enter the dreams of others and to affect them, to an extent. I located your dream and watched you. Saw myself chasing you through the woods. You were having a nightmare that just happened to feature me. I can see why you would. My behavior so far has been atrocious." His admission startled her. After a few beats, she nodded. "At least you can acknowledge that." She was halfway through the second drink, the liquor choosing that moment to have an effect. "Still, a girl likes a formal apology." The vampire stood, going down on one knee next to her stool. "I, Mazik of the ancient tribe of Rain Dwellers, beseech you to forgive my actions. My intent was never to scare you nor to harm you. I allowed my enthusiasm to overshadow my good sense. I am sincerely and eternally sorry." Hollie sucked in a deep breath, moved by his speech. It must be the alcohol going to my head. But when he looked up at her, those striking eyes filled with sincerity, she found some of her anger slipping away. He was disarming, a mixture of effortless confidence and old-fashioned chivalry. "Stand up," she said after a moment, worried that they might attract attention before remembering it was her own dream. "I can't promise to forgive you yet, but we can continue the conversation." "That is more than I could have hoped for," he said, beaming at her. The tips of his fangs became visible for a moment, but they didn't cause the same instant instinctual revulsion as before. His behavior now was causing her to rethink her initial evaluation of the vamp. "Are you forgetting that he did the same thing not so long ago, back in your office? He charmed you, then scared the crap out of you," her inner voice pointed out. "But that was the dream version of him," she countered. "Not him. And if he wanted to hurt me, he would have already." Her inner voice was silent, but a thread of doubt remained in her mind. She only had his word to go on, not knowing enough about the creatures that existed in the web and their powers to evaluate his version of events. Maz stood, gently taking her hand and bowing over it. "I have a small favor to ask," he said, a hopeful spark in his eye. "That's bold, thinking I'll grant you a favor." Licking her lips to savor the remnants of sweetness left there by the syrup, the liquor made her consider. "But out of curiosity, what kind of favor do you want?" Her assessment of him could hang on the next thing he'd said. The vampire's current demeanor, combined with his insane good looks and the enhanced alcohol she'd consumed, was making it hard to find a reason to keep hating him. "I have found it hard to make it through many a night since I found you. It is physically uncomfortable, the separation. If I could have something of yours, a memento of sorts, it might ease some of the symptoms." "Whoa," Hollie breathed. "There is a lot to unpack in that request." Then she narrowed her eyes and scrunched up her nose and thought, "Can I even do that? Give you a memento? Won't it just disappear when the dream ends?" The vampire frowned. "Of course, I should have thought of that. You'll forgive me for saying so, but being around you is more intoxicating than all of the dryad syrup in this bar." Hollie smiled then, flattered by the compliment. "Maybe it's the alcohol or the way he's looking at me right now, but I'm beginning to seriously wonder if I misjudged him." They'd been talking long enough for her to finish 2 drinks, and he hadn't attempted to bite her or shifted to stalking and terrifying her. Maybe Maz is telling the truth. Giving in, she opened her mouth to offer to lend him something of hers for the duration of the dream. Before she could speak, the dream shattered around her. Hollie bolted awake, surrounded by pandemonium. Chapter 12.
"You've got to get up," Cass shouted at her. "The vamp could be here literally any second from now."
"What?" Hollie was filled with confusion, the remnants of her dream lingering. "I don't understand. What happened to the ritual?"
"Something interfered,"
the witch told her, grabbing her by the wrist to pull her toward the edge of the table.
"Something or someone. Hop down and let's get moving."
"We need to retreat, now." Phaedra's face was a mask of unease. Taylor's eyes were darting around the room, fear writ large on the Fae's features.
Everybody grab onto me. Cass dug into her jacket pocket and pulled out her wand. Yelling out an incantation, she waved it, and the same belly flop hit Hollie's stomach as the world turned sideways for a moment. She landed on her feet and immediately stumbled, falling to her knees on the uneven ground. The ground seemed to grow ridges, but it was the roots of the gray, drooping trees she remembered from her earlier visit. We're back on Samothrace. "What are we doing here?" Phaedra growled. "Is it smart to bring us back here? What if whatever interfered with the ritual follows us back here?" "We have no evidence that it might," Cass retorted, "and I need to consult with the High Council of Witches. What just happened should not have happened, and I need to know why it did." "Probably because you're incompetent," Phaedra muttered under her breath, and Taylor elbowed her, sending her a frustrated look. Cass's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond to the Fae's insult. "Let's get a move on. The council needs to hear about this immediately." "You must be pretty worried about what happened," Hollie said, picking herself up and dusting off her hands. "What exactly did happen?" Cass let out a long breath. "The ritual was progressing as it should have initially. You were asleep, and I was adding ingredients and chanting the proper words as the book instructed. A few minutes in, something shifted. I don't know how better to describe it, but I could feel it in the magic." The witch's expression was earnest. "My unfamiliarity of the spell was at fault, but I couldn't be certain that the shift wasn't part of the incantation, so I kept going. Then things got a little strange. Ingredients weren't having the effect I expected. Then we experienced a disturbance." "Disturbance?" Phaedra scoffed, rolling her eyes. "The whole bloody house started to shake. I thought the roof was going to fall in on us." Cass reluctantly nodded. "The incantation snapped, and the ingredients melted away. The ritual was broken, but by what or whom, I don't know." Hollie shivered, the gloom of the forest combining with the knowledge that the means they'd concocted to keep her safe from the vampire had failed so spectacularly. A part of her, though, wondered if she shouldn't be relieved. After having drinks with him, I was beginning to soften, but that was in a dream. It wasn't real. Was it? A sinister thought burrowed into her mind, making her sick to her stomach. Was it the vampire? Was he the one interfering? It would be a masterful manipulation tactic. Distract her in the dream while secretly undermining the spell being cast for her benefit. "I'm afraid I can't say for certain. That's why I need the council's help." Cass's face told Hollie that the woman was disturbed by what had befallen her spell. Although Phaedra had little confidence in her abilities, it was clear to Hollie that she wasn't used to having something go wrong with her magic. "It's just my luck that something went sideways with the incantation. Ever since the vampire walked into my life, very little has gone right for me. And now I'm back on some haunted world filled with untold dangers, once again a sitting duck for whatever comes along with a taste for humans." Hollie shivered, the failure of the spell and her ominous surroundings combining to ramp up her feeling that something awful was going to happen, and soon. "Are you sure we aren't being followed?" she asked, craning her neck and scanning the trees around them for any hint of an ambush. Cass hesitated before responding. "Last time we were here, I was confident that no one would dare to go against a worshipper of Hecate, but now—" "This is what happens when you trust a witch to do a Fae's job," Phaedra grumbled. "I'm sure your High Council will be just as useless as you've been." Taylor put a hand on the angry Fae's arm, but Phaedra yanked away from her. Her anger had been building for a long time, not just since meeting the witch, but ever since Hollie had chosen to stay with Gilly and Lena in the Fae realm, eschewing Valencia, which was a little too stuffy for her taste. Phaedra was a woman of strong opinions and a busy one, so being away from Valencia was frustrating for her, and she wasn't afraid to say so. "Pull out that bent stick you call a wand and get us out of there." Her anger had chosen this moment to crest. Taylor had to latch on to her arm to keep her away from the witch. "I couldn't, even if I wanted to, and believe me, I'd be happy to be rid of you." Cass glared at the Fae, not bothering to hide her own opinion of her traveling companion. Traveling by incantation takes a lot of magic, and I need a recharge before I can use it again.
See? Phaedra said, throwing up her hands. Useless!
Calm down,
Taylor told her, her usual mellow demeanor becoming brittle.
Cass is doing the best she can. It isn't her fault that something interfered with the ritual.
The breeze picked up, and Hollie wished she'd been able to grab a jacket while she was back home. I didn't expect my visit to be so short. The wind carried an unpleasant scent to her, and Hollie's nose wrinkled. What is that stench? The argument consumed the attention of her companions, so no one else seemed to notice. Hollie wondered for a moment if the smell was a fluke, a decaying animal carcass maybe, and she tried to ignore it, but the farther they walked down the muddy, root-strewn path, the stronger it got. "Does anyone else smell that?" she asked, covering her nose. "As soon as we get back to your little backwater of a village, we're going straight to your house and getting the hells out of here," Phaedra insisted, staring down the witch. From the expression on Taylor's face, Hollie could tell that she was worried that things might come to blows, physical or magical.
"As soon as we get back to the village, I'm heading straight to the council. I'll find somewhere to park you in the meantime, but the council may want to talk to you. So that means you're not leaving Summer Thrace until I get their approval." "Is that a threat?" Phaedra said, bristling. "Because I'm not fond of threats."
Hollie's heart rate kicked up, her concern rising. She knew that Phaedra was used to giving orders, not taking them, and her animosity toward the witch had already been high before Cass told her that she wouldn't be getting her way. Then another wave of stink hit her nose, and bile rose in her throat. "Ladies, I think something dead and rotting might be nearby. Do you smell—" Her words cut off at the sound of a long, ragged moan. The sound was close, and it grabbed the attention of the rest of the group. The warrior Fae pulled a sparkling sword from her back, her wings unfolding at the ready. Taylor tensed, and Hollie could see a pinkish glow appear at her fingertips. The witch began weaving intricate shapes with her hands, prepping some sort of spell, Hollie assumed. I need a weapon, she thought. After everything that happened on Aramanabad and the realms of the Fae, not to mention my vampire stalker, I should have equipped myself already. Hollie realized she'd been dependent on her stronger companions, but there might come a time when no one was around to help. Then I'll be screwed. The first figure staggered out from behind a nearby stand of trees a moment later, his rotting body writhing with jerky movements. The source of the stench was now apparent. He's dead, Hollie realized, her jaw dropping in shock. "Zombie!" Cass spit in disgust. "What the hell's is a zombie doing on Summer Thrace?" "Zombies, plural," Phaedra corrected when another undead shambled out after the first. "And don't act so surprised. You witches dabble in dark arts whenever it suits you. I'd be shocked if this forest wasn't full of nasty creatures." "I don't know who hurt you," Cass growled. "Witch or otherwise, I'm not to blame. So let's stop arguing and take care of these nasty creatures before they get close enough to bite." Taylor was the first one to strike, pink lightning streaking from her fingers toward the zombies. It hit the lead shamble, and the zombie stumbled and collapsed, but it pulled itself along on the ground, still moving forward. Phaedra wasted no time once the first shot was fired. She leapt into the air, her wings beating at the air with force, and soared forward. The fierce face swung her sword at the second zombie and lopping off its head. The thing's head tumbled off its shoulders, and the body stiffened and fell to the ground. "One down, a handful more to go." "Looks like it's more than a handful," Cass said, alarm filling her voice. "We have more incoming." The trees on the opposite side of the path shook violently, and a horde of undead creatures lurched out, numbering more than a dozen. Between the two groups, they were approaching 20 zombies. And who knows how many more are in these woods, Hollie thought, shuddering and taking a step closer to her friends. Cass's arm waving suddenly ceased, and a ball of flames crackled to life above her head. The witch mimed a tossing motion, and the fireball flew forward, exploding on contact at the feet of the zombies on their left. The creature's ragged, decaying clothing burst into flames, but they continued coming. "Not fire, you nitwit!" Phaedra yelled from where she hovered above the other group, attempting to chop at the neck of another zombie. "You've just made them more dangerous. You've got to take off their heads." Another bolt of pink lightning flew from Taylor, this time into a large and now flaming group. She aimed for the head as suggested, and the lightning zipped into a zombie's eye socket. The eye burst, reminding Hollie of a squished grape, and she turned to the side and doubled over, on the verge of vomiting. She lifted her head to see the zombie Taylor had hit keel over, and another lightning bolt whizzed toward the next one.
I'm getting close to exhausting my magic, the human affairs scholar squeaked, and there's still so many of them.
The horde on their left had reached the path and were only a few steps away from them, several of them actively burning. "Hollie, come toward me," Phaedra called. Unfortunately, giving the order distracted her, allowing a zombie below her to grab her ankle and pull her down to the ground. Hollie did as instructed, while Cass began shooting what resembled arrows made of solid darkness at their foes. Her arm was good, but their numbers only seemed to be increasing. For each zombie she took down, 2 more took their place. Hollie had almost reached Phaedra's side. The warrior woman had managed to extract herself from the enemy's grip, at least partially. She'd separated the offending zombie's arm from his body, and it still dangled from her foot, reminding Hollie of some sort of demented lapdog following after its owner. One of the creatures let out another moan, this one feeling like it was right over her shoulder. Hollie yelped and lunged forward, but a pair of hands yanked her to the side just before Phaedra's sword sliced through the air in the space she'd just been occupying.
Careful,
Taylor said, steadying her.
She's in the zone, and our best chance of escaping with our lives.
Phaedra looked every inch the hero, but Cass was no slouch either. She went on her tiptoes, sweeping her arms into the air and then flinging them forward. Shards of what looked like ice flew from her fingertips, obliterating the face of the closest zombie.
"Look out!"
Taylor warned, then flung herself at a zombie that had come out of nowhere. Hollie skidded backwards, but before she could react, a pair of cold hands grabbed her.